I want to welcome on your behalf Dr. Pat McCarthy, who's a native of Waterford. As you can see from his biography, he's written extensively on aviation. He is a real expert, and he's come to give a presentation on Irish training depot stations for Donald, Collinstown, and how do I pronounce it? Tallaght, is it?
Tallaght, yeah.
Good. Over to you.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Stephen and Guy Warner for asking me to come along. Because for me, it was an opportunity to revisit some work I had done 30 years ago on the trainings in Ireland. And in doing that, I found it a wonderful journey, and I'll come back to that. But just to put the training in its context, on the 12th of August 1914, the 4 operational squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps assembled at Dover prior to moving to France. The 5th No. 1 Squadron was busy exchanging airships for aeroplanes. So the only 4 operational squadrons, which consisted of 63 aircraft, 105 officers, and 755 other ranks, got ready to move to France, which they did the next day, led off by No. 2 Squadron, which was led by Major James Burke, a native of Armagh, and an ex-Royal Irish Fusiliers. Despite his best efforts, he wasn't the first to land in France. That claim goes to another Irishman, Lieutenant Hubert Harvey Kelly, a member of No. 2 Squadron, who took a short cut over a forest and got to Amiens before his commanding officer. I don't know if that warrants a court-martial or not, but he certainly did it. But just think, 4 years later, in November 1918, on Armistice Day, the Royal Air Force had 27,333 officers, 263,800 other ranks, 25,000 members of the Women's Royal Air Force, 22,600 aircraft, and 188 active squadrons. Now, the British Army in 1914 could have fielded about 11 divisions, the regular army, about 11 divisions, backed up by another 14 territorial force. Throughout the war, the British Army expanded until it could field 75 divisions. That's about a 7-fold expansion. The Royal Flying Corps / R.A.F. went from 4 squadrons to 188 active squadrons. That's the 50-fold expansion. That's unbelievable. And of course, when we talk about the active squadrons, we're talking about the visible side, the tip of the iceberg, in a way. Because to support that, you had a massive, massive infrastructure of training squadrons, logistics operations, various schools and so on like that. A massive infrastructure. And a small part of that was created in Ireland. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. That small part of infrastructure that was created in Ireland to support that expansion. Now before the war, there were no aerodromes in Ireland. There was no Royal Flying Corps presence. The first unit to come here was No. 1 Training Centre. I came across this when I was doing research 2 years ago on the garrison in Ireland in 1916, in the Easter 1916. Mostly composed of reserve and training units who acquitted themselves very, very well. But one training unit that does not seem to have participated in the suppression of the Easter Rebellion was No. 1 Training Centre of the RFC. They can't claim any credit for it at all. It was set up in the Curragh in 1915. It had quite a sizable establishment, some 38 officers and 2,000 other ranks, trainees. And that would have been in response to that type of advertisement. Skilled tradesmen, and notice skilled tradesmen included chauffeurs and motor lorry drivers. Also, high-class cabinet makers. Obviously, you could be a low-class electrician or wireless operator. You have to be a high-class cabinet maker. Some of those recruits would have been recruited locally, as evinced by a local photographer. And that photograph has been captioned in some areas as local recruits from Newbridge. But you can see the youth of some of them, joining up to acquire skill and to serve. But really, flying training in Ireland, to the best of my knowledge, that unit never had any aircraft. Obviously, it would have had quite a number of instructional airframes, but no flying aircraft. That was to change. Now let's look at flying training. Before the war, everything was very simple. You had the Central Flying School at Uphaven, and apparently most of the applicants had already a pilot's license, and if they were commissioned, they could claim back the cost of acquiring that pilot's license. So a really cheap way of training pilots. With the expansion, and one of the things that becomes quite difficult to follow, and I'm not going to go through it, but it seems to me that every time there was an expansion plan for the Royal Flying Corps, there was a corresponding plan for the infrastructure to expand, and as soon as that plan was just about halfway through, they brought in a new plan. So it keeps changing. So you had reserve airplane squadrons established in 1915 to support the Central Flying School. They were then renamed reserve squadrons, and the idea was there would be 97 of these reserve brackets training squadrons by 1917. Also, you had the formation of specialist schools, schools of gunnery, navigation, wireless, etc. The reserve squadrons were renamed training squadrons, and then in the last reorganisation they decided to form what were called training depot stations. Now, one of the reasons given for the training depot stations, forming those, was to economise on manpower, on administrative manpower, and also to save land. Think of it for a moment. I've seen a figure of just over 400 aerodromes and airfields in the British Isles by 1918. 400. Now each one of those would have comprised between 200 and 250 acres. That's 100,000 acres of prime agricultural land, because you don't build an aerodrome halfway up a mountain. Well, not normally anyway. And at a time when Britain was facing severe food shortages because of the unrestricted submarine warfare, saving land was important. So they decided to set up these training depot stations, each equivalent to 3 training squadrons. And as part of that, we meet Captain Sholto Douglas of the RFC. Douglas had had a typical career in a sense. He had joined the army, he was commissioned in the Royal Field Artillery, then transferred to the RFC, observer initially, took his wings, promoted to captain, promoted to major in 1916, OC 43 Squadron. Now, Air Marshal Athan referred to in Ballykelly sheep strikes. Early in 1917, Sholto Douglas was taking off from a field in France, and his aircraft hit a cow. There's no report as to what happened to the cow, but he was injured. And while he was convalescing, he was given the job of identifying suitable sites in Ireland for the establishment of these new training depot stations. Thankfully, he left quite a good account of his journey to Ireland and his experiences there in his biography. He flew a BE2C from London up to Stranraer, across to Larne, and then down to Dublin. He was very conscious of the changing political scene, so he landed in the Phoenix Park, went across to the soldiers on guard at the Viceregal Lodge, now the presidential residence in Ireland, and he entrusted them with guarding his aeroplane while he was inside talking to the Lord Lieutenant. He then would, with a car supplied by the Lands Officer of the Irish Command, he would go to places, he would fly over them, and he would identify them. And he seems to have had quite a wonderful 3 to 4 weeks in Ireland, being royally entertained at every place where he stopped. But among the places that he identified, he flew across here. He identified a cluster of aerodromes near Dublin. Gormanstown, there. Collinstown, now Dublin Airport. Baldonnel and Tallaght. He identified them as suitable places. He also toured the country. He identified Fermoy, not as a training station, but as an operational base. Fermoy was the biggest complex of British Army barracks outside of the Curragh and outside of Dublin. Oranmore, Omagh, Aldergrove. Most of the aerodromes that were developed, either for training or for operational purposes, was due to Sholto Douglas. Now, November 1917, work starts on these. And thankfully, we have wonderful series of photographs to cover the construction of these. They were all done to a common layout. 3 aircraft sheds, 1 aircraft repair shed, officers' mess, officers' quarters, and behind them the Women's Royal Air Force quarters. In all of these, they show these as the support huts for maintenance, spares, etc. They rarely show where the accommodation for the men was, but I presume that was slotted in at some stage. That was Baldonnel. And one of the first things they did was to lay a light railway line to each of these. That one there was the one coming from Lucan Station on the main Dublin-Cork line, where they put in additional sidings, then ran a light railway up across the canal to Baldonnel. They did the same thing at Gormanstown, they did the same thing at Tallaght, and I presume they did the same thing at Collinstown. That was an early photograph of Baldonnel, March 1918. You can see that the officers' quarters are well built. They've started on the women. The hangars are very, very slow. That seems to be the last thing to be completed in each of these. And in a way, given the complexity of building the hangars, that's understandable. That's Baldonnel months later, in September. And you can see there that the hangars are still not complete. Virtually everything else is, and presumably the tented array there would have been for the NCOs and the other ranks. There you can see one of the hangars under construction, quite a complex operation. And there you can see they're almost finished, except this one still being finished, and that was early 1919. Gormanstown the same. You can see the canvas hangars which had been used while they were finishing off the main hangars, the 1, 2, 3 airplane sheds and the maintenance shed. Tallaght, you can see the hutments that were built there. Now, one of the things that these actually did they provided very, very substantial employment. When the first week that Gormleston building, the contractor there, because it was all civilian employees, had a weekly wage bill for his first couple of weeks of £20. By April, this time 100 years ago, the weekly wage bill in Gormleston was just over £3,000, which would suggest over 1,000 employees working on that, and the same with the other three. And as an aside, 100 years ago this month, Ireland, particularly in the south, would have been focused on anti-conscription. This was the key month in the conscription crisis. And it seems to me there were at least 4,000 guys who were quite happy to work on the aerodromes Monday to Saturday, but probably on Sunday took part in the anti-conscription demonstrations. And again, while most of the buildings were hutments and Nissen huts, important ones like the officers' mess were always completed in stone. We are lucky enough to have how it presented itself to one aircrew man coming over from the UK. A 3-ton lorry conveyed us to Tala and the barely completed aerodrome, a bleak, mud-bespattered expanse bestraddled by a network of light railway lines used to bring materials from goodness knows where. Our quarters were in canvas Besino hangars. We slept on rubber sheets at first, and at the camp we had little to do except watch the workmen completing the permanent hangars. Now, and that was Tala when it was almost finished, but again you'll notice this is where the hangars were. They hadn't even really started on those in the summer. The last bit to be completed. Now, what was the establishment of a training depot station? You can see it there. 52 officers, 180 trainee pilots, rank and file 336. Notice women 154, but they just say 4 women. No ranks, just 4 women, 7 and household 54. So there would have been a total strength of 858, with 72 aircraft, 36 Avro 504s, and the same number of DH9s. The 4 TDSs in Ireland were designated as bombing stations, bombing instructors. So they were all equipped with the DH9. There was also 20 Crossley tenders, some motorcycles, 1 touring car, and I would probably have to put in brackets for the use of the CO only bracket. Now, you can see there the R.A.F. girls in Tala, all looking very happy. I wonder about the hat worn by this particular lady. It doesn't look like regulation issue. The air crew, well, they're more sprightly turned out, but at this stage the hangar has been finished and photographs can be taken indoors. The aircraft that were used in these were all 504 for basic flying training, the DH9 for operational training. But another unit that we'll come to, number 19 Squadron, was equipped with DH4s. But apart from the 4 big TDS stations, there was a network of support. They were put under the command of number 11 Wing, which had its HQ in Merrion Square. Nice place to have a HQ in the centre of Dublin. Portobello Garage was the place where aircraft were assembled and tested. The aircraft were not flown over the Irish Sea. They were brought over and assembled in. That garage persisted until the 1950s. You can tell it's the 1950s by the proliferation of television areas at the back on that. But it seems that when they assembled the engines in particular, they would bring them outside and they would run them at high pitch to test them. the noise must have been horrendous. But that didn't matter at the time. You also had a stores distribution park. A disused distillery building in the centre of Dublin, in Marrowbone Lane, was requisitioned and used as a store. And it had to have a capacity to support 220 aircraft. So that would have been a central store. It was also proposed that an Irish aircraft repair depot would be established. This would have been a major establishment at Lucan, where you would have had motor and engine repair, engine and airframe repair sections, salvage section, etc. It never got beyond the planning phase. By August, the aerodromes, though not complete, were available for use. Number 22, there was 22, 23, 24 and 25. Each one was formed by taking two existing squadrons, training squadrons, transferring them over, and by August most of those have moved over. They've begun flying training. The operational target dates were the 1st of October for Gormanstown, 9th for Collinstown, the 25th for Baldonnel, and the 23rd for Baldonnel and the 25th for Pala. And we don't know if they ever became fully operational. But by October 1918, those four units had a total of 184 Avro 504s and 41 DH9s. Obviously the DH9s would have been required. The training squadrons were not first called on operational aircraft like the DH9. When you add in the operational squadrons, those, the one that was stationed in the south, you would have had almost 250 military aircraft in what is now the 26 counties. That figure has never even got next or near it since. That was the highest ever number of military aircraft stationed in the south. But just as they were getting operational, and we're told that, if you read the newspapers of the time, that people would come out from Dublin to watch the aviators enjoying themselves. Just as they were getting operational, the Germans sought an armistice. Now, I mentioned 19 Squadron. That was a training squadron which had moved to the Curragh in December 1917. It was supposed to be a training squadron. But for most of the first 6 months of 1918, it was employed on other duties. Liaison, delivering mail, keeping an eye on Sinn Féin meetings, etc., etc. So much so that when HQ 11 Wing in April 1918 looked at the monthly report and sent a note to the commanding officer saying, there is nothing here about training hours, to which he got a reply saying, we have had no time to do training. We are doing all these other activities. In support of these other activities, they used a number of temporary landing grounds, and some of them you've got to hand it to the officer who picked. A field alongside Adair Manor, courtesy of the Earl of Dunraven, would have provided very, very nice accommodation, and other ones similarly. The one that mystifies me is the one that was called Athlone. It actually was in Fairbairn, which is a significant difference away, because I think there was a touch of the Michael O'Leary there, calling something in Fairbairn Athlone. Also, the first fatalities. A Sergeant Giopel and a Private Wardell killed when a DH-4 crashed in May 1918. But as I said earlier, there was also to be an Irish Flying Instructor School, to be formed in October 1918, based at the Curragh. Again, the idea was that in each command there would be a flying instructor school to support a group of these training depot stations. It never really formed, was disbanded early in 1919. The only photograph I've come across shows what's deemed to be the Curragh airfield. You can see the canvas hangars, you can see aircraft there. They were stationed in Beresford Barracks. Whether or not the airstrip was near that barracks or not, I do not know. But as I said, before they got going, as I mentioned about the one in the Curragh in 1915, there was quite an emphasis on recruiting. Now the conscription crisis, by May 1918, Lloyd George recognised that he hadn't a hope of conscripting anybody in Ireland. Not a hope. Despite the view of Sir John French, who is now the Lord Lieutenant, who believed that if he was allowed to create, as he said, a number of air parks from which the rebellious young Sinn Féiners could be bombed into submission, unquote, that conscription could have gone ahead. Lloyd George wasn't willing to try that, but instead, to cover his tracks, a very large recruiting campaign was launched in May 1918. What's interesting is there was a slight increase in the number of volunteers, of recruits, but almost half of them went for the Royal Air Force. And we get reports in the local newspapers, meetings held all over the country, R.A.F. officers giving presentations, and in one of them, about 5% of the audience made very audible protests. But the recruitment, at least for the R.A.F., seems to have been quite successful. But demobilisation followed very quickly. Baldonnel in February 1919, Collinstown April, August Tala, and finally in September in Gormanston. Very little flying was done in those months, and the officers and men were demobilised. In October it was announced that Tala, Collinstown, Gormanston were to be evacuated by the R.A.F. and all flying activities were to be based at Baldonnel. Tala and Collinstown were left more or less derelict. Gormanston was handed over to the Royal Irish Constabulary for training of recruits. For the R.A.F. itself, some 420 officers, 200 cadets, and almost 400 other ranks were demobilised from Irish stations. The demobilisation process was usually that you were transferred to a station nearest your home. So that would suggest that that number of people were Irishmen demobilising in Ireland to available for their homes. Now, in a way, you could say it was a short burst of activity. You could say that it had no impact on the war effort. By the time they had been formed and got going, the war was over. But they did leave a legacy. You could say they left two legacies. One was what was initially called the Irish Free State Air Force. The intelligence branch of the R.A.F. kept a very close eye on what was happening in Ireland as the Civil War broke out. And as the Civil War broke out, Jack McSweeney, himself an ex-R.A.F. pilot, had been appointed commander of the new Irish Free State Air Force. And the R.A.F. intelligence branch, and it's worth reading it, the future of it will depend on three things. One, the amount of money to be made available. So what's new? The ability of the government to secure an experienced and competent pilot to command the Air Force. They had no respect for McSweeney or for Charlie Russell, his second in command. However, they did say their ability to procure trained pilots and mechanics It is understood that there are a large number of ex-RAF ranks now resident in Ireland who will be willing to serve. There are also a large number of Irish ex-RAF pilots, but it is doubtful whether the better class of Irish ex-officers will feel disposed to serve in the Free State Air Force in view of the admittedly very low social standing of the majority of officers in the Free State Forces. You can say a certain arrogance in that, but despite those reservations, the Free State Air Force, the Irish Air Force, set up initially manned largely by men who had trained in terms of the air crew, of the support staff in the TDSs and pilots, some of whom may well have trained there as well. The other legacy was the infrastructure. The great thing about infrastructure is once it's built, it's built. You very rarely see it dismantled. So Collinstown, now Dublin Airport, handling almost 30 million passengers a year. Baldonnel, the home of the Irish Air Corps, and has been. Gormason, which was used by the Air Corps from the late 1930s until quite recently, and is still, the structure is still there. Tala is the only one that's gone. It was used in the 1920s as a depot for the army, and a lot of it had been, of the buildings had been destroyed mostly by vandalism after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So the Irish Army tended to use it for manoeuvres, and hence the tented village that's there. But as late as 1940, December 1940, the Luftwaffe believed it could be used as an operational airfield, because that photograph was taken during a reconnaissance flight by the Luftwaffe in December 1940. Since then, it has vanished under a sea of concrete, and I believe where the officers' mess is now a franchise for a fast food outfit. How things change. Thank you very much.
Dr. McCarthy has got to go off at lunchtime, so he's willing to take a question and then we'll have a break. So any questions for Dr. McCarthy?
Not a question to begin with, Pat, but just a very brief point of information. McLaughlin and Harvey, well known firm in this part of the world, they also had offices in London. They were responsible to a great extent for the construction of Bronxton. I don't know whether you knew that or not.
Yeah, and thankfully their record survived, and I think it's fantastic the way you can say, £20 a week, the total wage bill at the beginning, 3,000 a week, which is a huge amount of money, and certainly represented over 1,000 workers at the time. So you think about it, 4,000 very well paid jobs. And as I said earlier, Monday to Saturday they were quite happy to labour on there. And I'm sure on Sunday, particularly in this month, the month of April 1918, they were busy demonstrating against conscription.
Yeah, one other question there.
Can you give slightly more detail about the garage at Portobello as to where its location was?
Oh, it's just down from Cottabrua Barracks, which was then Portobello Barracks. I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but as you come down Rathmines Road, you cross the canal, and just to your left, I certainly remember it as a garage many years ago. It was also used for making batteries, which was an appalling industry. If anybody ever worked there in terms of exposure to chlorine and so on like that. It is now apartments on that. It's like most inner city sites where you had inner city factories, it's now apartments. Well, you can see the canal there and that. But apparently, as I said, they used to bring the outside, the aircraft engines outside and run them. If you're running 2 or 3 of those, you won't sleep late that morning, that's for sure. On that. So it's just there at the canal. On that. As you come down Rathmines Road, as you cross the bridge, look to the left.
So it's quite close to the pub?
It's quite, yeah, quite cold. Well, every one of them, well, sorry, Marion Square and that one and Marrowbone Lane would have been quite close to pubs. The guys out in Gormason, Collinstown, Baldonna and Tala, they probably had to travel for their drinking.
I see you did some extensive research.
Can I thank Dr. McCarthy again on your behalf for a wonderful presentation. I've certainly learned a lot. Thank you very much indeed.
I just conclude by one little thing. I said it was a wonderful journey for me. Oh, I have to get through this very quickly, but I think it's worth it. When I was doing this, I found so much had been done by others. People like Michael Whelan, Tony Cairns, Joe Gleason, who was here, Michael O'Malley, Colonel in the Air Corps, Damien Smith, Carl Hayes, and of course Guy Warner. It was so easy to put this together because I borrowed, I nearly want to say stole, but I borrowed shamelessly from their work, their tremendous work. And if you have any questions, if you can ever lay your hand on that book, it's an absolute treasure in terms of the history of the Royal Air Force in Ireland at that period. It's an absolute treasure. If you have a copy, treasure it. And thanks again.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As some of you, if not all of you, of course, will be aware, it should be Guy Warner standing here giving this presentation, but last Monday week Guy went through major surgery. I'm delighted to be able to tell you that he got out of hospital on Monday of this week and is making a very, very good recovery. But he asked me if I would pass on to the conference his very best wishes for a successful conference, and this I do gladly. In his opening remarks, the Air Marshal referred to the 5th generation fighter in the form of the F-35 Lightning. Just on the subject of generations, I often consider myself a member of the Flintstone generation, if I can put it that way, and one aspect of that is that I'm very unfamiliar with PowerPoint. In actual fact, this is only my second PowerPoint presentation. I say that quite deliberately in the hope that you will bear with me if the presentation is a bit disjointed. Obviously, in asking me to give the presentation, Guy handed over a memory stick and some notes. I've tried my best to familiarise myself with both. Well, time will tell just how successful or otherwise I've been. Anyway, to begin, again I think the talk was billed as a talk about the two, and there were only two operational RAF squadrons that served here in Ireland during the period of the First World War. Other operational squadrons came along later, but there were only two, numbers 105 and 106. But as you'll see from the title there, that is Guy's title, he has decided, or had decided, to concentrate on the activities of 105 Squadron. Possibly for obvious reasons, because 105 Squadron served at the airfield here in Ulster at Omagh, which we'll see in a moment or two. 106 Squadron, on the other hand, was based initially right down south in Cork at Fermoy. And we heard something about Fermoy from Dr. Pat McCarthy earlier. Both squadrons, 105 and 106, were formed, in the case of 105 certainly, in September 1917. And initially it was slated to go to France after a period of training. But again, as we heard earlier this morning, by the early part of 1918, unease and unrest was growing here in Ulster, as indeed throughout Ireland, at the prospect of the introduction of conscription. And in recognition of that, the Air Ministry decided that it would probably be wise to send both those squadrons to Ireland rather than to France. So it was that 102 Squadron arrived via Aldergrove, incidentally, which again we heard reference to earlier on. An airfield which at that stage was really only underway in terms of its development. Facilities were very, very poor, and that was reflected upon in the diaries of some of the officers of 502 Squadron who came over. One of whom we'll hear more later, was a Captain Bowen. In fact, he was in temporary command of 105 when it was first formed back in September 1917. But by the time they arrived at Omagh, they were under the command of a Major Douglas Joy, a Canadian, one of at least 2 Canadians who actually served in 105 Squadron during its time at Omagh. Major Joy also kept extensive diaries, which Guy has had considerable reference to, and his talk, of course, is based to a considerable extent on those diaries. They came initially with RE-8 aircraft. Now here's where I hope I can forward. Yep, there we go. Diagrams of RE-8 aircraft. 2-seat aircraft, pilot and observer. The aircraft was armed, as you can see, with a Lewis machine gun, which the observer would have used. Their purpose, to a large extent, whether in France and of course here in Ulster, was to carry out photo reconnaissance. They were equipped often with cameras. In fact, to a huge extent, certainly in the early stages of the First World War, photo reconnaissance was a very important aspect of what the Royal Flying Corps initially, and then in due course the Royal Air Force, was actually doing. The role of the squadron here in Ulster was essentially army cooperation. In actual fact, although they couldn't have been aware of it at the time, for obvious reasons, what 105 Squadron ended up doing was setting the groundwork, so to speak, for Operation Banner, which of course many of us here will be aware of. It lasted throughout the Troubles, and again the roles of the Royal Air Force during Operation Banner, and indeed the Army Air Corps, were very much, to a very large extent, to assist the security forces and the police and so on. And that's exactly what 105 Squadron ended up doing when they were based at Omagh. In due course, they also had detachments at a number of other airfields, which we saw earlier again in one of Dr. McCarthy's maps. Oranmore, for example, in Galway. Castlebar was another one. But anyway, at Omagh, which of course we may as well, for those of you who may not be terribly familiar with our local geography, there is Omagh out to the west. And the site that they were located on, there is a photograph incidentally of one of 105 Squadron's RE-8 aircraft overhead Omagh, Omagh being in the background. And that is the site at which they were based. About a mile or so to the north of Omagh, for those of us who are reasonably familiar with the local geography, overlooked from the main road to Newton Stewart, from the region of the Nestles factory. Now, my knowledge of Omagh has deteriorated somewhat from I was in the planning service. I'm not sure whether that Nestles factory is still there or not, but if it is, well then in fact it more or less looked down on the site. The facilities in which you can see there, there were a couple of canvas Bessonneau hangars, again which have previously been referred to. The accommodation for the officers and other ranks was tented. And there in fact is the house occupied by the Scott family, Mr. Roland Scott and his family, who owned not only the house but of course the land upon which the airfield was developed. There is the house which is still there. That's how it looks at the present time. And, oh, hang on. Yeah, that was it at the time. And there is the airfield site, as it is now. But it was exactly on that land there that the airfield itself existed. There were, of course, no hard runways back in those days. The river you see is the River Strew, which proved to be advantageous to the squadron in a number of ways. Lots of fish were available from it, and full opportunity was taken. to catch them and eat them. It was also used for bathing purposes, and sadly, as a consequence, before very long, was the scene of a tragedy which affected one of the members of the squadron who actually drowned when bathing. Moving on, another quick point to mention in relation to the presentation that Guy put together. He has 38 photographs here. In the time available, it's going to be very difficult for me to talk about all of them, so what I've decided is that the form that my talk will take will be I'll simply go through the photographs, and those in fact which would be the object of something of particular interest, then I'll elaborate a little bit. So moving on, squadron personnel with at least one mascot, which you can see there, with the RE-8 aircraft in the background. Another photograph of squadron personnel. The Scott family, in association with a couple of officers. Unfortunately, I'm not able to identify the names of the officers concerned. One of them possibly might be Major Joy, to whom I've already referred, or Captain Bowen. At the time that the squadron arrived in Omagh, of course it was a time definitely of growing unrest. Sinn Féin had been active, references have already been made to them, and I'll say no more about Sinn Féin in the present circumstances and in the present context, but they had been active as part of the growing unrest, and yet, despite the unrest which certainly existed, and I suppose it reflected to a considerable extent the nature of the Omagh community, which was of course a mixed community, and still is. Nevertheless, 105 Squadron was very, very warmly received, and there are lots of comments to that effect in the squadron records and the diaries that I've already referred to, kept by Major Joy and Captain Bowen. Just moving on, another quick shot. I've already referred to records, some of which of course were in the form of the pilot's logbooks, an example of which we see here. Recording, of course, the activities that they were up to with the aircraft, and to a large extent, of course, those activities took various forms. There would have been a training aspect, a continuing training aspect. They would have been from time to time meeting up in the flying sense, of course, with army units on the ground, carrying out what would have been called contact patrols. And this was an aspect of their work in assisting the security forces. Every now and again they might get a call to go to a particular place and meet up with and identify an army unit for one purpose or another. So that was very much part of what they were about. Again, just simply another example. I mentioned earlier about them being equipped with cameras. In fact, 105 Squadron, on the basis of the records, was extremely well equipped with camera equipment. And there is an example of how it was put to a particular use in that case. It's a photograph of what I think is the main street in Omagh. And if we look very, very carefully, then in the photograph we should see Major Joy's wife, who's with another lady, on their bicycles shopping in Omagh. What it took to make sure that he got that photograph, a little bit of planning obviously, but there you are, there's the result. Just another more good, so I'm moving to. On one occasion, just picking up again on what I talked about there about the great relations, the very good relations that were established between 105 Squadron and the local community. It resulted on one occasion in an open day, I think it was towards the latter end of June in 1918. It's pretty obvious, I think, that quite a considerable number, if not all of them, are ladies. Egg and spoon race. All sorts of activities were arranged to be part and parcel of this open day. And let me just see if I can get a reference here, which is actually taken from Major Joy's diary. I'll just read it out to you if I may. On the 25th of June, in preparation for the squadron's at-home day, A formation of 12 aircraft was assembled, which flew to Finton and back. Stunts were also performed over the airfield, and in due course I'll come to a photograph of the R.A.F aircraft of the squadron that was selected for that particular aspect of the activities. Our tea party on, continuing on from the open day, illustrating again the kind of activities that were organised as part of this developing good relations with the local community. Our tea party on Tuesday afternoon was a great success, fine weather. Everybody came, about 300, from the village barber to the Earl of Belmore, and they all were summoned by the police for using their cars to come in. Now, what exactly that means, I'm not quite sure, but there you are, it's in the record. In the middle of the afternoon, the police turned up and took the numbers of all the cars. There have been several dances and tea parties during the week, but I have not been to any. The only other excitement I have had was a day's fishing at Trillick, but I only caught one fish, a trout of about 1 pound. We had 4 other large ones though. Next Tuesday is our guest night. Again, worse luck, for I am tired of entertainments. This is a comment, by the way, by Major Joy, who naturally, as the officer commanding the unit, would have been in great demand at these various functions and parties and so on. Part of his reason for becoming increasingly feeling under pressure from all of this was that his wife, during the initial period, in fact of quite some months when they were at Omagh, was living in England with their very young daughter. In due course, in October 1918, he was able to bring the two of them over to rented accommodation in the town itself. And that's just an example of lots of his recordings in his personal diaries. So obviously it wasn't all work as far as 105 Squadron was concerned at Omagh. There was lots of times for relaxation and developing good relations with the local community. Again, very, very much, certainly I feel, very, very much in keeping with the same situation under Operation Banner, a situation which many of us came to be very well accustomed to and very appreciative of. But anyway, let's just move on. Again, quite apart from open days, from time to time the Scott family would be invited to come on the station for one purpose or another, and there again is an instance of that. Similar one. Again, obviously something unusual is happening there as part of what I've been talking about. So that, I think, is Captain Bowen, the chap on the left. From time to time there were accidents, some of which were accidents fortunately, but some also, and I'll come to one such instance before very much longer, with tragic consequences. Let's keep moving on. Yes, in fact, there is the R.A.F, which I made reference to earlier, with Captain Bowen, which he used for stunt purposes, certainly what were described as stunt purposes during the open day. Just more examples of the squadron's aircraft. Again, the Bessonneau hangars in the background. Interesting photograph of what was known as a Hux starter. Sometimes the aircraft would be started by swinging the prop, but quite often, in fact, this particular device would be brought into use, which would be driven up against the nose of the aircraft and disengage with the propeller to spin the propeller and fire up the engine. I mentioned earlier about one tragic consequence of a very, very serious crash, and viewing the time, in fact, I'll try and bring my presentation to a conclusion just simply by reading out an extract really from a local newspaper about the worst tragedy to befall the squadron when they were at Omagh. It occurred on the 13th of November 1918. It was a Wednesday, and early that morning 3 RE8s had taken off from Oranmore, the airfield in Galway that I mentioned earlier, where 105 Squadron kept the detachment. So they were returning from Oranmore to Strathroy when, only 9 miles from Omagh, over the village of Dromore, unaccountably 2 of the aircraft collided with each other. One of the machines, flown by Lieutenant James Wilson, aged 20, and with his fitter, Corporal Thomas Bradshaw, who was only 19 years old, in the observer's seat, burst into flames as the petrol tank exploded. The other, which was flown by a 21-year-old Canadian pilot, like Major Joy from Toronto, Second Lieutenant Lawrence Booth, accompanied by Air Mechanic Robert Gowdy, aged 22, and Booth's little dog, lost the aircraft's left wings. Both aircraft plummeted to the ground, killing Wilson Bradshaw and the dog, mortally wounding Booth, who succumbed to his injuries shortly after the crash rather than being killed instantly, and badly injuring Gowdy. The third machine was flown by Captain Bode, whom I've referred to earlier. It turned around and landed on difficult ground between the 2 crash sites. Despite the best efforts of local farmers and others, it proved impossible to save the life of Booth. So in due course a funeral was held, and that's what we see there. I think I've got a couple more photographs of it. The other chaps who were killed were taken elsewhere for burial. Booth, on the other hand, was buried in the local cemetery in Omagh. There is obviously the cortege making its way through Omagh itself. And there it is again coming through the gates to the cemetery, which would be, I think I'm right in saying, on the Belfast Road in Omagh. So, quite a tragic circumstance. The war grave, the grave is very well tended, I have to say, and of course is marked by a headstone for those of you who may not be aware of it, or may be interested in having a look at it. There it is. Commonwealth War Graves, of course, who are responsible for caring for it, and it is extremely well cared for. In due course, towards the end of 1918, 105 Squadron began to receive these aircraft, Bristol fighters, one of which you see there, and in fact I think I've got another one coming up, yes, another Bristol fighter. The photograph looks as if it may have been taken, in fact, at Strathroy. Just a couple more shots again of the site as it is today. I think this one's just quite similar. And I've just overshot my time, I see, by about 5 minutes. But I want to end, at Guy's request, just by paying tribute to Dr. Haldane Mitchell. Some of you may have known Haldane Mitchell. He died only a comparatively short time ago, I think just over a year ago. He was a local historian whom Guy and I met on more than one occasion, and a tremendous help he was in terms of uncovering some of the information that has formed part of this presentation. So thanks very much indeed for your patience. That concludes my talk. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, a privilege actually. I'm Keith Liddy. I'm a professor in historical geography. Historical geography is a great subject. It sort of sits between history, geography and archaeology. One of the reasons I'm here today, I suppose, really is because of those interests actually, and in particular the contribution that those subjects can make to our understanding of the very rich heritage of aviation within these islands. And I was very pleased about 6 months or so ago to be able to talk to Tara Scott and Dave Hammond about RAF 100 and the possibilities that exist in universities, including my own university, Queen's University Belfast, to get involved with RAF 100, and that's really what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. So it's kind of what I'm talking to you about this afternoon is somewhat different perhaps to what we have heard so far. Very interesting historical accounts of the RAF and its developments over the past 100 years, and we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, this afternoon as well. My focus is rather more on the legacies of this rich aviation heritage and the ways in which we might try and engage wider communities to look at this rich aviation heritage, be interested in it, record it, document it, value it, protect it for future generations. So we stand here at RAF 100 looking back, but as we heard this morning from Air Marshal Atha, we also need to look forward. And I think the heritage that we have is something which we bequeath to future generations, and it's important, therefore, now I think we take stock and look at what aviation heritage there is within Northern Ireland. I'm going to focus on Northern Ireland. My background is as a geographer, and the RAF has made probably a sort of unwitting contribution to the development of my discipline of geography, particularly through the role of maps and map making during the First World War, and the significant contribution that aerial reconnaissance and aerial survey had to play in the development of cartography, of maps and map making. So in the First World War, the transition from ground survey to aerial survey was a transition that had ramifications really throughout the 20th century and really changed the face of maps and map making. So that's my small nod here as an academic geographer, recognising that service, that the pilots who flew those early aircraft across the Western Front, taking those risks, taking those aerial photographs, as in this case for the Sami Chegval. Important at the time, of course, reconnaissance for mapping trenches, as you can see here in this example, but ultimately the skills, the techniques, the spatial technologies, we would call them today, that were developed at that time have served us well over the intervening decades. But I'm not going to give you an academic talk about maps and map making, maybe for another day. I'm going to talk to you about action stations, exclamation mark. This is an initiative which we've been working on, that is me and my colleagues at Queen's University Belfast, with RAF 100, in particular Dave Hammond, Tara Scott and Chris Haining here in Northern Ireland, to try and develop a programme of outreach, particularly aimed at younger people, to inspire younger people to become interested in the legacies of aviation, military aviation in Northern Ireland. So to focus in particular on the infrastructure, we heard about this morning, the infrastructure that was so critical in the development of aviation in Northern Ireland over the past 100 years, and to focus in on that infrastructure and to record it and document it. So Action Stations is the title of this initiative, and I have here some little flyers which I'm just going to give to the gentleman at the front here. Maybe you could take one and pass them along. And so my talk really today, in the next sort of 15-20 minutes or so, is going to focus in on this initiative, Action Stations. And I want to say something about what the initiative involves, how I hope that you will also all be advocates of this particular initiative, that you'll take it out into the wider community and to engage young people and to use it as a vehicle for engaging young people in looking at aviation heritage. For me personally, Action Stations has a certain kind of resonance, because 30 years ago, as a relative youngster, in my late teens, I was fascinated by the remnants of Second World War airfields in my part of England, where I grew up. I used to cycle out on my bike, proper geography, cycle out my bike to the countryside, visiting various the sites of Second World War airfields, using many of you will be familiar with this series, I'm sure, Action Station series. I've given you the cover there of the volume for this part of the UK. Taking those volumes out into the field, in a sense being not just a geographer but an archaeologist. And here I am 30 years later standing here using the same title, Strapline Action Stations, hoping that this might be, again, a way of inspiring people, younger people, to do similar sorts of things. Guided, of course. One can't just start wandering around military establishments. So, Living Legacies 1914-18, the subtitle here, R.A.F. 100 and the Defence Heritage Project. Three elements really for the Action Stations initiative, which I want to outline for you by way of background, but I'm going to focus especially later on what Action Stations involves, and then especially the digital resource, the website that we've created with RAF 100 colleagues for public use. Living Legacies is a public engagement centre. It's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So if you're a UK taxpayer, your hard-earned cash some of it gets fed into the research councils of the United Kingdom, some of that gets fed into the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which looks after the arts and humanities, and academics like myself try and get money from the AHRC to pay for projects. That's the origins of Living Legacies. It's one of 5 public engagement centres focusing on the centenary of the First World War, working in partnership with the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Imperial War Museums as well, and a variety of different universities. And Living Legacies is a centre, public engagement centre, based at Queen's University, Belfast, which is where I am, but working with these other universities. And our main interest is to link together academic researchers, people like me, with community researchers. There's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise in the wider community, interest in the past, and one thing that we are trying to do through Living Legacies, through the centenary of the First World War, is to make connections between the academic community, the academic sector, and the wider community. So we focus on particular research themes, and one of those research themes which is particularly relevant and pertinent to what I'm talking about today is to look at landscapes and material culture, in other words, archaeology. So we have a particular interest in that. We also have a particular interest in digital technologies, which you'll see in a minute is also relevant in terms of developing websites. Talking of websites, we have a website. You can look at it there, Living Legacies 1914-18.ac.uk. So if you're interested. Our main purpose is to work with communities, and this is why RAF 100 Inspire was a programme which I immediately thought, great, this is exactly what we are about. 1918-2018 is critical in all sorts of ways, not just the formation, obviously, of the RAF, but also the cessation of hostilities in November 1918. So it's a very important year marking the end of the First World War. So we do work very closely with communities. We do all sorts of interesting sorts of work involving local communities, excavations, creating exhibitions, workshops. There's a workshop tomorrow which we're hosting at Queen's with the Council for British Archaeology on their Homefront Legacy project, and these are free events like the one today. So that's our purpose really, and we work very closely with our partners like National Museums Northern Ireland to develop exhibits. We had a big exhibition in 2016 commemorating 1916, and that was highly successful. And Claire Ablett, who's actually just at the back, is one of our project officers who works on Living Legacies, but also through the museum. And we develop resources, and a PhD student of mine, Rebecca Milligan, has developed an online resource around World War I aviation in Ireland. This was her work as part of her master's thesis, which is using an online mapping platform. And I was very interested to hear the talk this morning about training stations, because some of the sites that Rebecca was looking at, you'll see them on that list there, we heard about this morning, of course in much more detail this morning. But these are resources which are freely available, and they're trying to engage the wider community, but also to provide an infrastructure, interesting materials for people to use, to look at the past in interesting kinds of ways. We're working at the moment with Carrickfergus Borough Council and Sharon Murphy. Sharon is in the audience, looking at Larne or Bentra airship station. We're trying to get money from HLF, fingers crossed, we'll hear fairly soon, Sharon, I believe. So to try and again engage local communities, the local community in East Antrim, to look in more detail at the landscape associated with that particular flying station. We're also working very closely with the Department for Communities, and have created with Department for Communities Historic Environment Division an online resource which was built up from a project which has been going for about 20 years called the Defence Heritage Project. And with our digital capability at Queen's, we've sort of revamped the website for Defence Heritage Project, and it's an important part of what I'm going to mention today, because it is a way in which the wider community can access information about defence heritage, which of course includes military airfields and military aviation sites. So again, it's an online platform, it's free to access, anybody can use it, and it's informative, we hope. One of the things we're trying to do at the moment is encourage people to use it, which means going out into the field, looking for evidence in the landscape relating to defence heritage. It is a multi-period platform, so it's across the last 150 years, to go out into the field to gather information about what exists out there, and then to feed that information back into this web mapping platform, it's called. It's a crowdsourcing project. So there's a mechanism there to learn about what exists already, what the state of knowledge is, but also then to make a contribution to that knowledge, and ultimately to the protection of those sites, because this is a project that's managed by the Historic Environment Division. So if you want to look at this again, the little dots on these maps, if you click on those dots, then information pops up about the sites. And at the moment, some of those sites, there's relatively little known, or well, there's a lot known about them, there's a little recorded, I should say, on the Defence Heritage Project website. So the potential exists to make a contribution to giving us more information about the state of preservation of these sites as they exist now in 2018, but also to make a contribution for the longer term for people to learn more about these Defence Heritage sites. So I've just picked up on there the categories. You can see different kinds of categories are used by the Defence Heritage Project for different kinds of sites, and then the pop-ups, if you click on the points on the map, a little bit of information pops up about those sites, including the grid reference, so you can actually use that then to visit the sites. This is I think we looked at this earlier, Ernie, this is OMA, and this kind of gives you a sense of the limited amount of information that is currently on the Defence Heritage Project database, which we can add more information to through the crowdsourcing platform. That's the idea, really. So we have Living Legacies, providing this connection between academics and the wider community. We have the Defence Heritage Project, which provides the digital infrastructure to make that connection possible. And now we just need something to actually galvanise this and to push it out into the wider community to engage people, and especially, I think, younger people as well. And this is where R.A.F 100 fits in for us, because it is another critical component. That's the recording form for the Defence Heritage Project platform. Very simple to use. But we want to try and encourage people to use these resources that we're creating and to engage with that landscape, that rich aviation heritage which exists within our landscapes and our countrysides around us. So this is why Action Stations was really born, through discussions with initially Tara Scott, Dave Hammond, and latterly Chris Haining at R.A.F. here in Northern Ireland, to think about ways in which we might be able to bring these elements together and to develop a programme particularly aimed at younger people, and particularly aimed at the R.A.F. cadets squadrons within Northern Ireland. So we've had some conversations around that. So we've got some plans for 2018 as outlined there. Where we are now, April, it's already April 2018. What do we need to do for the next 6 months? And this is one of the reasons I was so keen to come and talk today, partly really just to say, can you help us? You know, you have the contacts, you know those groups, you know those cadet squadrons, you know the leaders. Are there ways in which now you might better help us in a broader sense to make Action Stations work? Because we've invested a lot of time and effort and energy into this. We've got a great resource, this online platform you'll see in just a minute. Now we need to use it, we need to promote it. And this is where we are, I hope, all able to assist. So what Living Legacies can do for you, so to speak, in terms of your groups, if you're linked to groups, young people, is to provide practical advice, support. We can create workshops, we can help you with developing resources and using resources and developing those partnerships. So for us then, one of the first sort of critical elements to get in place by April 2018 was to have a website, a web resource, which provides information for people about former military airfields in Northern Ireland. Now already there's a lot of websites out there, there's a lot of printed material out there, so we wanted really to try and bring together what we saw as the key elements. If you were doing a research project and you want to know about a particular airfield, let's say for the sake of argument Ballykelly, where do you go? How do you find out about that particular historic airfield? Where do you go to? And we wanted to create a resource that would be sufficient in its content and advice to practically help a group of people, a community group or cadet squadron to actually do the work. So that's what we've created with R.A.F 100 colleagues, and what I want to do now in the last 5 minutes or so is just give you a flavour of what's there on this website. Right, so the homepage, this is our URL, our web address. It's on the piece of paper that's just gone round as well, go.qb.uk/RAF100, and that will take you to our Action Stations web resource, which is the one-stop shop. It's the place where this information resides. So we've written this in a way that we hope will appeal to the non-specialist, to the 14-year-old or the 16-year-old. Interested, savvy, technically savvy, but not necessarily knowledgeable about some of the historical details of sites they might be interested in visiting and recording. So this is a platform which has been created by the Centre for Data Digitalisation and Analysis, a mouthful, at Queen's University Belfast, along with us at Living Legacies, in particular David Hardy and Tony Anderson. So the homepage is a homepage, and then the next kind of key part of the website is getting started. We wanted to be able to create a step-by-step sequence for the non-specialist in a user-friendly sort of way. So if you're trying to research and visit an historic airfield site, what do you need to know? How are you actually going to do this work? What sources can you access free online? So we've created a step-by-step guide, how to find sites, what to look for at sites, airfield sites, historic airfields, what to do when you actually do the field visit on site, and what you can do after your visit as well. So there's a whole sequence of steps there. And we're trying to push here existing resources. There's a huge amount of information available, information overload actually. So this, what we're trying to do here is say, look, focus on this resource, the PRONI Historical Maps Viewer. Brilliant. It's absolutely, if you don't know it, it is such a superb resource. It includes all the historic 6-inch maps for Northern Ireland with modern aerial imagery, and it's a geographical information system, but it's online. Anybody can use this. Even my dad can use this, right? You know, it is a user-friendly resource. So what I've got here is just an example which shows you the early 1920s Ordnance Survey 6-inch map for Aldergrove, which this is all from the online historical maps view from PRONI, superimposed, layered upon a modern aerial photograph. And the maps are georeferenced and georectified, so one sits on top of the other. So you can juxtapose one landscape, the modern landscape, with the historic landscape. You can look at the historic features on the map and compare them to the modern features in the landscape. You can look at the legacies of the past into the present. A fantastic resource. So we're making use of those resources through our Action Stations website. We wanted also to make sure that any research is fed into the Defence Heritage Project, so that has legacy. So the research being done by the groups actually has some value above and beyond the value it gives them to do the work, but a value which can be used by the Department for Communities and Historic Environment Division. So we have the materials there, which Emma McBride from Historic Environment Division has been developing. Way in is through a map. It's a way of visualising the locations of the airfields. Very simple to use. You just click on one of those points. That then takes you through to our particular airfield page, in this case Aldergrove. And then within the particular airfield page, you've got site plans, a site description, aerial photographs, historic and modern, maps, historic and modern, and then you can go back home. So just to take you through some of those site plans, we are so indebted to Hendon. I was very pleased to hear the lady this morning from Hendon speaking. We are so indebted to the R.A.F. Museum at Hendon, and also Dave Hammond's very hard work in securing for us the historic site plans for each of these airfields. This is a fantastic resource. These site plans are so detailed from the period itself. You can probably tell there, this is for Aldergrove, but not only are site plans beautifully drawn, but they are labelled, they have a key, they have a legend. Every single building on that airfield site plan is identified, which is a superb resource now for people to go out into the field and try and locate and identify those features. That's something you'll be able to do through this Action Stations website. The sites themselves, we have a brief description which draws upon published sources in particular, which has been put together by Heather Montgomery as part of the Living Legacies. We have aerial photographs. Some of these have come from the MOD, very detailed modern aerial photographs, and some of them are historic aerial photographs, and we're very much indebted to Guy Warner and Ernie Cromie especially for being able to help us so much with getting access to these historic aerial photographs, which again, a fantastic resource for helping people to understand what survives in the landscape. The map sources derive largely from the PRONI historical map viewer, which use modern day Ordnance Survey or LPS mapping, so it's something else we can use, and of course overlaying, as I've just shown you, the historic maps with modern aerial imagery. All of these sorts of resources are there, available for download, available for accessing through this new website. The idea is then that these resources can be brought together by groups, perhaps by cadet groups, squadrons. They can go out into the field, they can annotate the maps, they can use them for research purposes to learn about those airfield sites and make a contribution to knowledge. This is an example I had for the Ballynahinch. Is anybody here from Ballynahinch from the squadron? Not Fred, Fred's not here, no. A fantastic group of kids actually, and we met at Aldergrove. It was such a superb afternoon of looking at these maps and trying to identify features. This is Maghabry actually, it's a map of Maghabry where we're trying to identify the features from aerial photographs and so forth. So we are now live. Okay, so you can now access this. There's a bit of fine-tuning, as always with these things, a bit of fine-tuning still to be done. Some of the content I need to make a few changes to. There will be changes over the next few months as we get more information being put onto the website. But basically, folks, it is there, it is live. Please use it. Please make use of it. I've just put up this slide here because one of the things I thought this might hopefully help, this talk, help us to achieve, is to initiate a series of projects. If you are interested in working with us, R.A.F. 100 and Living Legacies and DHP, then now is the time for us to think about formulating these projects. Now is the time to think about what the groups might be able to do within a particular kind of time frame, what contribution this work might make to their own badges as cadets, or if they're entering the R.A.F. 100 schools competition, these sorts of initiatives. So now is the time to project formulate, then do the desktop studies in the early summer, and then think about outputs towards the end of the year. As a kind of finale, I suppose, for us anyway, of our Action Stations programme. So finally then, thank you very much everybody for your attention, but these are the acknowledgements without whom this would not have been possible. So I'm hugely indebted to those named, and others indeed, are on that list there on the right hand side. So thank you very much for your attention.
Earlier, you'll have heard Ernie managed to address the operational squadrons. Pat was talking about the training squadrons in Ireland. So I'm going to focus on those who served operationally abroad, because there weren't specific Irish squadrons abroad. Having said that, some did have a significant Irish character, so I'll try and concentrate on those which have a significant Irish element. But with the turnover in personnel in squadrons over the course of the war, you'll find that they're just that the institutional memory is lost very quickly. But we'll just
the computer.
Okay, so we'll just say that in terms of the overall context, many will be familiar with the 10th Irish Division, obviously the 36th Ulster, 16th Irish Division. Overall numbers, we estimate roughly about 40,000 casualties. So in terms of the overall numbers who served, the airmen, they're not that significant statistically, but they made a huge contribution in terms of the participation rates, as you in terms of what they achieved relative to their numbers. Pat mentioned earlier that in the final months of the war, recruitment was approaching 4,500. Almost 50% of those recruited in the final months of the war were to the R.A.F. rather than to the Army or the Navy. In that context, approximately 7,000 through the duration of the war. So it shows the massive increase in those final months. It's not to say that in the early years there wasn't a significant element, it's just that the numbers at the outset were tiny. In terms of aerial victories, people counting scores, it doesn't reflect the overall input. Like you have to look at not just ground attack operations, you have to look at aerial reconnaissance, photography, lighter than air used for spotting U-boats, for ranging artillery. There's quite a diverse contribution. But for those who do look at the statistics in terms of aerial victories, 800 aerial victories, it's quite significant given the numbers involved. Just in the broader context, I would mention in terms of lighter than air, like there's a huge contribution in the flying services for those who served in different contexts. Neville Florian Osborne, you'll know from Guy Warner's research in that area, the chap has a significant contribution to the lighter than air, the SS class airships. Glenn Curtis, we always associate with the flying boats for the early war years, but the Port Hull, as it was known, was the main component of it was developed on this side of the pond. It was John Cyril Port. They were called Americas after the initial flying boat that Port was to fly a transatlantic crossing, but the intervention of the war prevented him from doing so. He travelled back to the UK and enlisted with the Royal Naval Air Service, and from there developed a whole series of projects on developing the flying boat. I just mentioned Mervyn O'Gorman. The story is well known in terms of his work at the Royal. We think of Concorde and we think of all the other developments of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, but in his day it was still just in transition from being the balloon factory. He was a target of quite a lot of concern over, let's say, how he developed perhaps infringement on intellectual property, because what they would test was effectively private sector development that then became a supposed standard that he would set. Overall though, like John Dunville, I just mentioned earlier, there was reference to the female aviators. His wife, John Dunville, also flew lighter than air balloons in the pre-war years in different competitions. Now John Dunville named his one of his kite balloons as the Banshee. Now we don't know whether that was a reference to his wife or not, but he wasn't required to rename it, so we'll take it that it stuck. Now Pat mentioned earlier just the move to the transition of the early Royal Flying Corps to their move to France. Pat in terms of 105 airmen, about 700 ground crew. Of those, I say at least 16, because there's a broad parameters of what's Irish and what isn't. Many Irish families, English born, they still continue to join Irish regiments, they still return to the Irish ancestral homes and so forth. Self-regard, self-described as Irish, but the birthplace, it can often be somewhere in India, or it can be a garrison town, it could be Aldershot. So when I say 16, it's approximately. Also in the early months, some of the pre-war aviators, you probably have heard of the 6th Earl Ansley, certainly you probably have heard of the 10th Lord Carberry for other reasons, like his intra-war, he was invalided at the early months of the war, went on then to a flying career in Kenya, all sorts of controversy attracted him. He supported all sorts of notionally progressive causes, but on a personal level, he had quite a few marriages and quite a few his siblings, his children wrote memoirs in which he was not the most fondly recalled person. Just to mention the Flying Marine, Eugene Louis Gerard, some of the early bombing raids. But once again, these were significant in the context of such limited ability of the aircraft at the time, that they were effectively tossing bombs overboard until they could develop release mechanisms. Robert Erskine Childers in the Cuxhaven raid on Christmas Day in 1914, he was an observer. He had developed the maps for the operations as well, like a lot of the planning logistics. It's not just in terms of the flying, it's the overall combat operations. In terms of August 1914, Charles Burke was mentioned earlier by Pat. Of the squadron itself, though, it had participated in Irish manoeuvres in 1913. It had flown from Scotland to Ulster and then down through the Midlands. Of the individuals, George Patrick William Dawes was one of two people with the surname Dawes, so a lot of confusion about some of his career history. And Catherine Francis Fitzgerald Waldron, they were both Irishmen, and Waldron managed to divert to fly to Kildare at one stage during the Irish manoeuvres, so ostensibly to visit the barracks there, but it was to visit family as well. Edward Drew Littledale Cornwallis, Hubert Dunstable, Harvey Kelly. The early operations in 1914, we would mention that Harvey Kelly was the first to land in France. It was an unauthorised shortcut, leaving his commander not best pleased. Charles James Burke continued to serve with No. 2 Squadron, eventually returned to the army later in the war. But Hubert Dunstable, Harvey Kelly, first aerial victory. It was aggressive flying, and then finishing it off with the pistol and some petrol and matches on the aircraft that he had forced to land. Of the early airmen, I just mentioned the first POW from the flying services was an Irishman, Indian-born Irishman at that, Victor Somerset Erskine Lindup. The Erskine element, the family married twice, his father did. There was from Antrim, and then I think his second wife was from, I think she was from India. But basically the Erskine Lindup family, there were two other brothers, one killed in the war and another who served in the flying services in the intra-war years. William Foster McNeice, you'll probably be aware of his connections with Donegal and Derry, Londonderry. He changed his name by deed poll later, and so he's often known as William Foster McNeice Foster. He didn't delete his middle name. So, he was famously not shot down by Sholto Douglas. We mentioned Sholto Douglas earlier. There was, but Foster McNeice won the DFC for surviving being shot down. Just mention Thomas Westrop Mulcahy Morgan was part of the early operations to France of those 16 men. He was later in command of the 19 training squadron that Pat mentioned earlier. A training squadron that, when it came to reporting to 11 Irish group, he was reporting his operations. For the 55th training wing, when they were asking what training have you done, he was too busy to do any training. He was too busy with operational matters. Hyacinth Joseph Anthony Roach, early casualty in January 1915. Like the various squadrons had a significant Irish component. You're talking of the 16, like most were highly decorated in those early months of the war. I just mentioned, like Robert Smith Barry was injured with, he did serve at number 5 squadron, albeit for August, September, injured in a crash with one of the dreaded BE-8, the bloaters they were known as, very unpopular aircraft, not many served, and those, they were probably the Germans' best ally in terms of eliminating some of the early pilots, though obviously Smith Barry went on to Gosport School and training and really developing pilots. In terms of the aircraft park that accompanied the Earl of Meath, the Honourable Clive Maitland, Patrick Babson, William Dawson Beatty, very unfortunate chap. His cousin was also named William Dawson Beatty. Their fathers were from Antrim, and they both married Wexford women who were sisters. It was just one of those bizarre double dating elements, but they ended up naming the kids. So if you ever try and look up William Dawson Beatty's records, he was another DSO. He got into quite a bit of difficulty with the aircraft park in terms of his attitude of make, do and mend. Like when aircraft, he felt the airframe was still operational, it could be brought home to serve as a training. But unfortunately that meant that those who survived the transit cross-channel crossing, quite a number were killed on the return journey when coming off duty in the Western Front to bring back various states of disrepaired aircraft that Beatty insisted would be good for returning to the home establishment. George Ivan Carmichael, of those early men, I just mentioned him as one of those early Distinguished Service Orders in 1915. There was rumour going around 5 Squadron at the time that a 100-pound bomb would be equipped to one of the aircraft. Now, the capacity of the engines was barely enough to lift a person, like at the time. Like in terms of adding 100-pound weight, it was the likelihood of actually being able to develop a release mechanism that would function was another huge drawback. And then we found that he wasn't the only one. Like every man in the squadron volunteered to fly this operation. It's not a medal hunting thing, but he duly managed to take off. It was a variant of an early Martinsyde. It managed, I think, it barely reached 1,000 feet for much of the operation. He did manage to release the bombs successfully on Menin railway station. He suffered, there was no proper bomb aiming equipment. There was a hole cut in the floor as part of the guidance for it. And the release mechanism with the string didn't work either, so I think there was some stamping involved as well to get it to arm it and to release it. It was, he survived to tell the tale. And in that context, I think someone in the squadron thought that was their VC chance, came and went. So he probably would have had to have been shot down probably to have clinched it. But in terms of 1915 then, how it developed, all the early aircraft were very limited in terms of their flying capabilities. With the Fokker-Eindecker, with the synchronization gear for a machine gun to fire through the propeller, the early aircraft were just, there was a massacre. Having said that, some of the deaths of the early Irish, let's say, aviation pioneers, like Dennis Corbett Wilson was killed by anti-aircraft fire. Like the German fire predictor control instruments were still at a very primitive stage, but they were learning, like you'll see in pilots' memoirs, Flaming Onions and things like that, where they're ranging the altitude. But that whole process was a learning curve for both those in aerial combat and those countering it. But in terms of 1916 then, like as we go through, the Fokker menace continues. Some of the earliest further casualties amongst the early pioneers, but in terms of the war on the Western Front, one of the significant elements was the war over the Somme, and in terms of the Irish contribution to that, I just mentioned briefly Arthur Lionel Gordon Kidd, from an Ulster family, though born in Dublin. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross for a bombing operation as well, but by this stage the Distinguished Service Order seemed to be the threshold at that point, though unless it was posthumous really, like there was if you survived one of these 100-pound bombing raids, the DSO was the threshold one was being recommended for. Now in terms of the various fighter squadrons, I just mentioned there 24 Squadron and 60 Squadron. Like I was actually considering doing perhaps one of those, but because it's just in terms of the sheer diversity of people. I'll just mention 24 Squadron because it was one of those, specifically a scout squadron, fighter squadron, of the early pilots. There was an Ulsterman and Sidney Edward Cowan, David Mary Tidmarsh from Limerick, Albert Erskine Carson Archer was from Portrush, County Antrim, though his family lived in Dublin for quite a number of years. Now, two of the flight commanders were Irish. Like it's significant in terms of the numbers of the time. I won't go through the full detail because just as a squadron, like the early pushers, as they were known, propelling from the back. I suppose if some of you have driven a rear-wheel drive car, if you've done it on ice, it's a dangerous prospect because propulsion's coming from behind rather than front-wheel drive. With these, there was a considerable amount of drag created by the tail booms. Also, if the engine misfired, there was often the potential for, if anything blew, to detach the tail unit and leave the cockpit, the cell, kind of free-falling. What they did have is a clear line of fire, frontward fire, and that allowed for them to fight on level terms with the other aircraft of the time. As a result of those early pioneers, like Cowan was decorated with the Military Cross with 2 bars. I won't go into medal citations, but they were often like individual combat missions of particular distinction would earn the Military Cross. Later in the war, one could have 3 or 4 kills to one's name and still not receive the same degree of recognition. Having said that, the early aircraft were of such primitive nature, and the capabilities were such that it was still a minor miracle that they could fly, let alone engage in aerial combat. Just Cowan transferred to 29 Squadron, which was under another Irishman, William Arthur Grattan-Bellew from Galway. Now they also owned part of what was Bellewstown, right, part of Louth, parts of Galway, but they also owned significant lands holdings in Laois and Offaly, Kings County and Queen's County at the time. So he's a person that had obituaries in every paper when he was killed in the war. But unfortunately, young Cowan, the notice came to the family via a number of second-hand accounts. One particular former student, fellow student of his of Marlborough College in England, had come across his grave and wrote to the family. Well, he wrote to the headquarters, who eventually relayed it on to the family, but there was still a minor dispute at the time as to whether it proved date of death or just as to when one should cut off the flying pay element and for the wages already advanced. So there was a bit of bureaucratic wrangling over him. And just David Mary Tidmarsh, as mentioned, 24 Squadron, prominent family in Limerick and Canucks, the department store, the first aerial victory for 24 Squadron. And from there, he did a full service for the first 6 months with the squadron before returning to be equipped with what was now going to be the Bristol F2, the Brisfit. And he was one of those selected to go back to develop that as a weapon with 48 Squadron. When he eventually came back with 48 Squadron, shot down by Kurt Wolff, famous German ace. Tidmarsh was one of those where they was very unlucky. The initial use of the Bristol fighter was as a standard 2-seater, where they relied upon the rear gunner. The engine power, the sheer muscle of the aircraft, but you'd often hear in pilots' memoirs the Bristol biceps. It took a massive amount to control it. But when they learned to use it as a climb and dive operations, it could fight as well as a single-seater, but also having the benefit of the rear gunner. But of the early operations then, the prisoners' memoirs are often the mix of fact and fiction. They're trying to, allay the concerns of the families. On the other hand then, their memoirs are also trying to talk up the dangers they faced. So you find cases where he claims he was lined up against a wall where they pretended to try and shoot him. Now, in reality, though, he was along the War of Independence. He was caught up in an IRA ambush where there was actual live fire at the chap, but he survived. Another early pilot in terms of 24 Squadron, I'll just mention him briefly. He took over from Tidmarsh in charge of Sea Flight of 24 Squadron. He was killed in that transition from, let's say, the pusher aircraft were now meeting their match with the more advanced German aircraft. The fact that Germans are now grouped into Jagdstaffeln, like there was no longer just individual aircraft, fighter aircraft interspersed amongst fighting units, that the Germans were beginning to restructure. So it was as much as the technical superiority of the new aircraft, but also the organisational element of it too. And he fell to the guns of the famous Oswald Bulk. Leno Hawker, the early commander and officer of 24 Squadron, he does have a significant amount of positive mention of the various Irishmen who served on them. I won't stay too long in 1916 because it's still it's a very early stage. Just to say that Byrne's mother continued to correspond saying, don't do anything for the moment, he might still be a prisoner of war. There's lots of letters go into the War Office and to the Casualties Branch. They have to keep writing back to her and say, look, the prospects is he's dead. And then this is into the 1930s. She's telephone calls like saying that she's heard that, there was injured people found in mental hospitals in Germany. Is my son amongst them? And they have to keep writing back to say, look, there's no one who hasn't been identified at this stage. That's just the nature of, and there's no prospect to regard him as being still alive. 40 Squadron, another early squadron, Scout Squadron, huge Irish contingent as well. The FE-8, another pusher aircraft. Squadron Robert Lorraine had almost managed to cross the Irish Sea. He crashed a couple of miles short, a couple of hundred metres short, landed in Howth, just off the coast of Howth. So he was nearly the first person to cross the Irish Sea. Major celebrity, Robert Shaw, the writer, was often in regular correspondence with him. He attracted a whole entourage, but as a result, though, it meant that some of the Irishmen who served amongst him also attracted a certain amount of notoriety. As I mentioned already, William Arthur Grattan Bellew, there's no point in going through the detail, but Dennis Osmond Mulholland from Donaghadee was one of the early operators. But there's quite a significant number. I won't mention some of them because when it comes to the detail, like the stories are quite similar. They're young men, in many cases transferring from an army regiment. In some cases, with the ability of the aircraft at the time, they've engaged in a significant amount of aerial combats, but the actual decisiveness of some of the outcomes, they're talking about aircraft still being, let's say, in 1916 you could still talk of an aircraft being forced to land, and that would be an aerial victory. By 1917 that would be largely dispensed with. But some of the other operations, you'll find that an aircraft that was shot down, that you could still have it driven down and damaged as a category in 1916, and that would be an aerial victory. The idea was, the purpose was to clear the skies of enemy aircraft, whether the enemy aircraft went down in flames, or the fact that it was no longer there to do artillery observation or there to map your lines was one of the significant elements. Robert Gregory, the pre-war painter, artist, fed into that whole 40 Squadron drama whereby Robert Shaw was writing to Robert Lorraine, and he had a significant amount. As I mentioned earlier, the first kill for 24 Squadron went to Dave Mary Tidmarsh. First kill for 40 Squadron was to Dennis Osmond Mulholland. that's a theme throughout the war. There's quite a number of firsts, or the highest scoring pilot is often an Irishman in a lot of the Western squadrons. I won't go to the detail, but some of the pilots managed to build up a certain profile for them, but they're the aerial combat's nature of it, it gets quite repetitive in the early years. You can see that Lewis drums at that stage, I think, was 50 rounds of ammunition, like the amount of, so you could see someone in 3 changes of drums in the course of an aerial combat. It's still pretty light in comparison to what was happening elsewhere. In terms of, just mention briefly of those various early successes, like there were quite a number getting official recognition. It was the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross, quite a degree of recognition there. But in terms of 1917 though, the number of aerial combats increased massively. The number of squadrons in the field significantly so. I'll just mention briefly that you have to remember on the home front there was still operations, anti-submarine operations. There were also Zeppelin hunting, and Robert Frederick Lee Dickey from Derry City was credited with the Zeppelin, the L-43 in 1917. But there were quite a few high-profile casualties, like but overall, like still in 1917, you're looking at the number of aerial combats is still vastly out of sync with the numbers of personnel involved. There are no more than 2 to 3% are Irishmen, and yet you're looking, it's 10% of the aerial victories a lot of the time. I won't talk through Mick Mannock because he's kind of a well-known story. Like, his father was kind of a violent drunk, lies his way through a lot of things, gets jailed more often than not. Re-enlisting the different things. It's just that you'll see the 3 children there, Julia, Edward and Patrick. Patrick is actually Edward's older brother, and yet the names are reversed there. But it's one of these misleading enlistments. But the Dundalk is given as a birthplace rather than Cork or Aldershot or all the other birthplaces that have been attributed to Mannock in his time. I'll just briefly mention then that in terms of the overall, that's one tribute feature of Mannock. Each pilot in rotation attacked the enemy aircraft. It's so frustrating with the other flight commanders when Mannock is sharing out victories, but there weren't decimal kind of contributions those times. If an aircraft was shot down by 3 aircraft, individual scores were incremented by 1, and the overall squadron total only went up by 1. Then the practice for 2-seater squadrons and single-seater squadrons varied a lot. So you often had a situation whereby there was a considerable number of aerial victories, but when people say Mannock gave them away, he didn't necessarily. Like, if he was sharing it with other people, it was often incrementing his own score as well as theirs. I won't mention George Henry McElroy because he's very much in the same lines. Early difficulties, subsequent success. One contrast certainly with 24 Squadron would be McElroy Hazel. Hazel was, anytime he flew, there was a massively increased body count, like on his own side and the opposition's. Like, he'd lead people into battles. Like, he had a great tussle with Hermann Göring in one battle. He shot down a number of well-defended kite balloons under the nose of the great German ace Ernest Udet, who claimed Hazel as a scalp, though Hazel's wrecked aircraft still managed to crash on the Allied side of the lines. Just in terms of how the air service developed, you've probably heard the story of Victor Henry Euston from Belfast and developing the Chilean Naval and Military Air Service, Alfred William Saunders in Lithuania. But in terms of the Irish Air Corps, just very, very, very briefly, because we're pressed for time, but many of those who joined the Irish Air Corps, or what was the predecessor of the Irish Air Corps, they were, many were from what became Northern Ireland. Many were also to the Free State, but significantly that they, like, there's one, Jerry Carroll, born in Warren Point, County Down. Like, he should have been a politician, like, he up north. He was studied in Gorey, County Wexford in the south. His father was a resident magistrate in Clare in the west, you know, and then he lived in Dublin in the east. You know, it's that kind of covering every geographical compass point you could. Just as Ernie had mentioned earlier in terms of Guy's talk, quite a number of those who served for the Irish group had also served operationally. It wasn't just with the TDS units. Like, some of those were who became the Irish Air Corps had actually flown operationally in Ireland against, let's say, Republican elements, or in other cases just routine kind of military operations in aid of the civil power. Others were wounded and returned to TDS units, but between that element, like, there were some came back with significant injuries. They were often invalided out. Some moved on to pilot training. There's the degrees to which they. I was going to mention Oscar Heron, because he was one of those who flew with 70 Squadron. Very well recognised towards the end of the war, because he was still flying in Camel in October 1918, by which stage it was obsolete in comparison to others. So although he's one of the highest scoring pilots of the war, of the final months of the war, it's an added achievement in terms of the material he's working with. He also served the Irish Air Corps, but of that element, like, there's in terms of the overall statistics, I just mentioned that it wasn't just, let's say, the 4,500 Irishmen that were mentioned by Pat earlier, that by 1918, that was statistically, like, it's only a statistical blip, whether you have 300,000 or 290 something thousand, like, you know, the Irish element is that small, but in terms of the contribution, it's quite significant. Now, I just mentioned, in terms of all theatres of war, it's like from the home front through to the Western Theatre, right through to Africa, Mediterranean. But then in terms of official recognition, there's one thing we do have. We can, at least from the days of the advent of the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Force Cross, they're specifically air awards, whereas previously it's very difficult to get a handle on the number of military crosses or distinguished service orders, because you're looking at people who could have obtained it in an army regiment, then joined the flying services. So in terms of trying to distinguish that, at least with AFCs, we have statistics. We know that approximately 1,000 were awarded in respect to World War I, because there was, and 40 Irish. It's about, it's 4%. It's about twice what the participation rate. And that factor too, like, even then, like, for some of the other awards, like I mentioned earlier, Mulcahy Morgan, who came back to command 11 training squadron in Ireland at the Cara. He received a bar to his military cross for escape attempts in the First World War. So there's quite a number there that where the recognition there, it's often not necessarily in terms of flying services elements, but there's still, in terms of the contribution of 6,500 to 7,000 men, I counted approximately 350 major awards, and beyond that, I'd say 800 aerial combats, but there are U-boats claimed. A member of the Cleve family of Limerick had a definite contribution to sinking a submarine. Some others have been attributed, those which we know from subsequent post-war dives were not so. But in terms of the beliefs at the time, the contribution was far out proportion to the numbers. But I'll just leave it at that, because I'm conscious in terms of time to give people an opportunity to perhaps ask questions. Thank you.
Set my presentation in some sort of context, and to some extent from what we've heard already this morning, of course, no context has been set, but just a couple of points to begin with. During the First World War, The average life expectancy of a frontline aircraft was 2 months. Imagine 2 months. Now, of course, another point, well, I'll come to the other point in a second, but to take the 2 months average life expectancy, obviously what the consequence of that was, a huge demand for aircraft. 2 months life expectancy, so obviously a huge demand for aircraft. So much so, in fact, that 1,000 firms throughout the United Kingdom were involved in one way or another in aircraft production. Aircraft at the time, of course, were very largely constructed of wood and fabric, and naturally that led to a huge demand for joiners, carpenters, people of that kind, craftsmen of that kind. So among the 1,000 aircraft, there would have been furniture makers of one kind and another, and just to give one aspect of it. And in turn, because of the intensity of the demand, the speed at which aircraft were required, that of course imposed tremendous problems on the labour forces involved. And again, perhaps not surprisingly, there was quite a bit of labour unrest generated. So despite all of that, of course, a huge output of aircraft. So let's just move on. Why is this not working, Stephen? Where is he?
I found it was working, just use the button.
Use the button on the computer.
And then kind of oh, actually no.
Ryan,
Yep.
you appear to be in the setup mode.
George, can you come up and help sort it out?
Get that, just get it. Get to your,
Remember what I said earlier?
there you go.
We believe you. Flintstone generation.
There you go. Now it should click through.
Now, the only thing is he can't see his prop.
Your prompt, can you
Yes, he just went
Can you
out
talk off
there.
that?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that look like top
Top there to
off.
the right. That's forward, or you can reverse.
Okay, so forward. Right,
Reverse.
forward reverse. Okay, all right, that's fine. Look, thanks very much, gentlemen. Sorry, thanks very much. Okay, just to continue. At the beginning, at the outset of the war, and I think this statistic was mentioned earlier, the Royal Flying Corps had 63 frontline aircraft. Royal Naval Air Service, somewhat more, 90. Small numbers. And by 1918, in light of what I was saying then about the huge demand and the huge effort that went into production of aircraft, 50,000 aircraft produced in the United Kingdom during the Great War, with the result that by the war's end, or almost by the war's end, 22,000 aircraft in the Royal Air Force. Despite the output of 50,000, there were only 20,000 aircraft in the Royal Air Force, which of course had come about by the amalgamation of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. So that's kind of a way of introduction. Among the 1,000 firms involved that I referred to was one which, on the face of it, seems quite remarkable, and I refer of course to Harland and Wolff. In 1917, on the 9th of July 1917 in fact, they were awarded their first contract for 300 DH-6 aircraft. Now the DH-6 aircraft was there it is there, that's the very first one that was produced by Harland and Wolff. I'm sorry that the photograph, it's not terribly clear, but like the R.A.F that I was talking about earlier this morning, it was a two-seat aircraft, primarily used for training purposes, but as the war developed, in fact, increasing numbers of them were used for coastal patrol work against potential U-boats. Okay, so that was at the same time as that contract was awarded for and I've got, by the way, a photograph of another. There's just a better photograph of a DH-6 where you can see quite clearly a two-cockpit aircraft. At the same time as that contract was awarded, another contract was awarded for 300 aircraft, Avro 504s. Now, the Avro 504s pictured there, in fact, are the 504K version of the aircraft. The initial contract to Harland was for 300 504 Js. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of the J version. That's why you're getting the Ks. There was only one essential difference actually. The J was built to accommodate one particular type of engine, the Gnome mono soupape. The Ks were fitted with bearers that could accommodate several different types of engine. Otherwise, the aircraft were basically the same. Like the DH6s, created as a training aircraft, and in fact, a very, very successful training aircraft they became. They continued in use by the R.A.F. well into the 1930s by virtue of a further development of the K, in fact, the so-called Lynx Avro in relation to the Lynx engine that it was fitted with. In fact, quite considerable numbers of them were being used as training aircraft by 502 Ulster Squadron during the 1930s. Again, I've got another photograph. There's another photograph of the Avros under construction in Harland and Wolff in 1917. Now, at this stage, not Harland and Wolff, Handley Page enters the scene. Now, Handley Page, well-known aircraft company, formed very, very early by Frederick Handley Page. Much later, of course, became Sir Frederick Handley Page. But they were very quickly on the scene. And again, the year 1917 is significant because in October of that year, Handley Page they developed a design for what in effect became the first British jumbo aircraft, the Handley Page V1500. That's one there under construction at Harland and Wolff. Harland and Wolff, in fact, they were contracted to build 3 prototype Handley Page V1500s. They were called V1500s, by the way, because they were a 4-engine aircraft. I've got better photographs later on, which I'll come to in a different context. But they were called V1500s because they had 4 engines, each of which was of such a horsepower that when you multiplied them by 4, then it worked out at 1,500 horsepower. And that was the best name they could come up with for them. But they were the largest aircraft built up until that date. As you'll see more clearly later on, if you can be patient and I come to the requisite photograph. But significantly, 2 men in particular were sent over to Belfast to work with Harland and Wolff's experts to actually design and build these 3 prototypes. The 2 men I refer to were George Volkert, V-O-L-K-E-R-T, and his assistant Francis Arcier. Men who went on to achieve even greater things, but that's another story. But they spent those last few months of the year 1917 working with Harland and Wolff's people to produce these 3 prototypes. The first one that was produced, because of course at that stage there was no airfield in Northern Ireland to actually fly them from, having built the aircraft in Belfast, it was then dismantled and shipped across to Handley Page's airfield at Cricklewood, just outside London, or just in London. That happened, it first flew there at Cricklewood in May 1918. Within a month, sadly, with tragic consequences, it had crashed. And one of the persons killed actually in the crash was a very senior manager in Harland and Wolff, a man called Cooper. Now the crash, of course, was attributed to certain failures of the construction of the aircraft, so modifications were required. Those modifications, the nature of them, was transmitted back to Harland and Wolff, and work began actually to incorporate those modifications in the aircraft that continued to be produced. And in actual fact, by that stage, in the meantime, on January 1918, a contract for 20 of these machines had also been awarded to Harland and Wolff. So not only had the modifications to be incorporated into the 2 remaining prototypes, but they also had to be incorporated into the 20 aircraft, work on which again, of course, had already begun naturally. So quite an involved business. Where am I? Yeah, sorry. Also, by the way, also by this stage, a contract for a single Handley Page bomber. By the way, I should of course have said that the Handley Page V1500 was designed as a bomber. designed, in fact, to have the ability to fly all the way to Berlin if necessary with a 3,000-pound bomb load. So quite a high specification. But as I say, in the meantime, in August 1918, a single Handley Page 0400 aircraft, a bomber not quite as big as the V-1500, a twin-engined aircraft, in fact, and significantly, the reason why only one was ordered was also by this stage of the game, America having entered the war, there were plans put in place for the Americans to build huge numbers of aircraft, obviously for supply to the Royal Air Force. And a single example of the Handley Page 0400, already built of course by Handley Page, had been shipped across the United States to enable them obviously to use that aircraft to help them decide how best to manufacture their aircraft. And the single version of an 0400 required from Harland and Wolff was simply to replace the aircraft that had been sent to the United States. Right, let's just keep moving on. There, just very quickly, is a photograph of some of the engines, two of the engines that were fitted to the Handley Page V-1500. They were always, well, in the course of time they were fitted with different engines. It so happens that the Harland and Wolff ones were fitted with Rolls-Royce engines, which those are. Two in each wing, a tractor unit and a pusher unit in behind the tractor unit. And for those of you who might be interested to see some of the hardware that went with aircraft like this, it just so happens that in the Ulster Aviation collection at Long Kesh, if you'll permit a little bit of, what's the word?
Advertising.
Advertising, thanks very much indeed. Then you can come along and see one. Although in the meantime, there's one even closer to where we are now. It's actually in St Anne's Cathedral. It was brought there at the request of the organisers, so it can be part of the special service this coming Sunday. Anyway, enough for the advertising. I mentioned earlier that when Harland and Wolff started building aircraft, of course there was no airfield for them to be flown from, hence the packing cases that you see there, into which the DH6s and the Avro 504s were in a dismantled state, obviously, packaged and shipped across to the mainland. But of course, by the end of 1917, early 1918, the need for an airfield had become more than abundantly clear, and work then began to create an airfield, which I'll come to in just a moment or two. But before I do that, just a quick reference to some of the gentlemen that you see in the picture there. Earlier on I mentioned Francis Arcier, that's the gentleman there. The assistant to George Volkert, the chief designer for Handley Page. Most of the other gentlemen I don't know, but I do think, and I mention them now, although really it would be more appropriate for me to bring them into the picture in a moment or two. But the gentleman there, I think, is an American called Clifford Prodger. More about him shortly. This man here, I think, is a Captain Patton. More about him shortly as well. Two pilots. I'm not 100% certain that that's who I've claimed them to be, but I have good reason to believe that that's who they are. Let me just very quickly move to another picture. I mentioned there about the decision had been taken very late 1917, early 1918, to create an airfield to enable Harland and Wolff to use it to test fly their aircraft. That's where that photograph was taken in December 1918, which is the date at which, in fact, specifically on the 20th of December 1918, the first of the Handley Page V-1500s to be produced in Belfast was actually test flown. Prior to that, in addition to the very first prototype that went out, which I mentioned some time ago, of the contract for 20, several of those were shipped out in similar manner in a dismantled state, because of course the airfield did not exist at that time at Aldergrove. But the very first of the Belfast-built Handley Page V1500s to be actually flown out from Aldergrove was on the 20th of December 1918, which is when that photograph was taken. A lot of dignitaries present, not surprisingly. There again, Francis Archier and his wife. That is Clifford Prodger, whom we saw, I hope, in the photograph just one or two earlier. And again, he was the pilot of that flew the first Belfast-built Handley Page V1500 out from Aldergrove with the assistance co-pilot of Captain Patton, which is the gentleman you see there. Another member of the flight crew, of course, you can see back there. I wish I could identify the other people in the photograph. Sadly, I can't. Although from the hats, which is the term I believe that was customarily used for managers in Harland and Wolff for many, many years, even after this picture was taken. From the hats, I guess that those must be Harland and Wolff gentlemen, who of course would have been present at the airfield for reasons which I'll come to again momentarily. There's just another photograph of the Handley Page V1500 you saw in the previous photograph. Outside a building at Aldergrove, which again I'll come to momentarily. That gives you a pretty good idea of the size of the aircraft. The wingspan was 126 feet from wingtip to wingtip. It stood 22 feet high and something over 60 feet in length. So it really was a monster bomber altogether. It was quite justifiably, as I think I termed it, the United Kingdom's first jumbo aircraft. There is yet another photograph of it on the airfield, taxiing back towards that large building which we had partial sight of just a moment or two ago. And finally, there is a photograph which we've already seen in my heading picture. That one, I think in particular, gives a pretty good idea of the scale, to judge from the gentleman there, and another one just behind him. The operational crew of this aircraft would have been about 6. Pilots, of course, and air gunners. That, in a way, in many ways, maybe shouldn't be there, because that picture wasn't taken here in Northern Ireland. It was actually taken at Bircham Newton, where some service people are pictured with one of the Handley Page bombers, which at that stage was at Bircham Newton, not to be used in anger, because of course by that stage the armistice had been signed and the war was over. So these aircraft, in fact, were never actually used in anger during the war. In fact, a number of them came to be used for civilian purposes, carrying passengers in India, among other places. But to come at last to the airfield, and I'll be concluding my talk with reference to the airfield, and that won't be finished in a minute or two, which is why I've given myself 10 minutes to do that. That, though, that's the operational order, so to speak, if you like, that gave effect to the creation of what came to be known, initially of course known as Aldergrove Airfield. It came to be known as Number 16 Aircraft Acceptance Park. It was one of quite a number of acceptance parks that were created right throughout the United Kingdom with the same purpose, to accept aircraft that were being constructed by these great number of companies that I mentioned at the very beginning. That was issued, I think, yes, October 1917. Hopefully I've got that right. Sorry, September 1917. There we are, by the Air Ministry. That was the site of Aldergrove. The site was one of those that was mentioned earlier on today, that was identified by Sholto Douglas when he was sent over in 1917 to identify sites for airfields and for the training depot stations that Dr. McCarthy referred to. It's an interesting diagram for a number of reasons. Note, for example, to the west, that is the Lisburn-Antrim railway track. One of the features of the Aircraft Acceptance Park was a branch line which came off the main line near the little hamlet of Aldergrove itself, which is just about there, ran right round the perimeter of the airfield site and they ended up quite close to this complex of buildings here. We've already seen photographs of this building. It looks like one building in that diagram. In actual fact, it was two buildings. The length being almost 600 feet. The two buildings were, on the one hand, an aircraft hangar, and immediately adjacent to it, and in fact, they formed, in essence, the one building, was an aircraft erecting shed. The purpose of the branch railway line, of course, was to facilitate the transport of aircraft in crated form being brought from Belfast to here to be assembled. To what extent that railway track was ever used, I've never been able to ascertain. Certainly, without a doubt, before that would have been completed, some of them, I dare say, were brought by road, but that was the purpose of constructing the branch line in the first instance. Why Belfast International Airport hasn't made, or it would appear not to have made any attempt whatsoever to reconstitute that in some form or another, I have never understood. Anyway, that again is another story. There were two aspects to the aircraft acceptance park. Given how it came about to facilitate the work of Holland and Wolff, most of the buildings were there to facilitate Holland and Wolff in one way or another. The building, of course, I have described. There were other offices of one kind or another, and I'll be touching on at least one aspect of that in due course. There was a separate camp, as it was referred to, and this, of course, was to accommodate the Royal Air Force personnel, who were also an essential part of this. After all, the aircraft being brought here were being constructed for the RAF, so they had to be on hand to receive them and look after other aspects of all of this. So the camp, as it was called, was there to accommodate RAF personnel. Other buildings were to facilitate the work of Holland and Wolff. I have two pictures now just of the buildings themselves. That photograph taken from what would have been the northwestern end of the site of the airfield shows, I think, very well the large building that I have just referred to, which was in two parts, as I've said, an aircraft hangar and an erecting shed. Other buildings, obviously, when this photograph was taken, this photograph would have been taken sometime in the early 20s. And by that stage, another hangar of sorts was being constructed, as you can see. This curious feature in the foreground, back in those days, the airfield, of course, like all airfields at the time, was a grass airfield. There was no hard runway of any kind. And rather than a windsock, there was what was called a smoke pot. So there was a large circle, identified in white, with an inner centre. And in the centre of that was a smoke pot, which would have contained material that would have burned and given off smoke, obviously to enable incoming pilots to identify the wind direction. So massive structure, the largest, in fact, the largest building of its kind in the country at the time, I believe. That photograph there was taken from the main Crumlin-Antrim road, which passed what back in those days was the main entrance to the site, which was just there. So this photograph was taken from the opposite direction to the one that we've just seen. That, of course, is still the main entrance to what's now Flying Station Aldergrove. It used to be Royal Air Force Aldergrove. Sadly, some years after the building was constructed, it was very, very badly damaged by hurricane force winds, and of course was never rebuilt to its original form. And it is, of course, now a listed building. At least that part of the original is a listed building with a very interesting roof structure. Of course, Belfast Truss, very interesting roof structure of the time. I want to just finish my talk, and I've got 5 minutes to do this, by reading from a report that was commissioned, or it was carried out by Air Ministry inspectors in August of 1919. Incidentally, just before I get into this, Aldergrove, or the Aircraft Acceptance Park, had hardly opened in the course of 1918 before the Chief of the Air Staff was actually saying it ought to be closed down. Fortunately for Aldergrove, his mind was changed, because even well into 1920, aircraft were still coming out of Harland Wolff, aircraft of the kind that I've been talking about, as will be evident in a moment or two. But I just want to end by reading, and it's a direct quote from the report that was drawn up at the time. In late 1918, Avro 504s were arriving at the aerodrome in packing cases from Harland Wolff and Belfast to be erected there and flown out. The assembled Avros were absorbed into other Irish stations under arrangements made by the Air Officer commanding 11 Irish Group. And then it goes on to, of course, refer to the training depot stations, which I needn't talk about because we've already heard about them. At this stage, there were about 300 military aircraft in Ireland, of which more than 150 were Avro 504s. And I can certainly tell you that a considerable number of those Avro 504s that were in Ireland at that time were 504s that had been manufactured by Harland and Wolff in Belfast. And according to the report, they were still being assembled at the rate of about one per week. Let me just move on quickly. Yes, in fact, I'll move over here. At that particular time, August 1919, the strength of the aircraft acceptance park was as follows. 22 officers, 330 other ranks, 69 Women's Royal Air Force. So that will give you an idea just of the number of personnel who were at the site. The inspector's report went on to note that the officers at Aldergrove messed in the Harland and Wolff canteen, and that for the general entertainment there were 2 tennis courts, a cricket pitch and a gymnasium, which presumably the other ranks and Women's Royal Air Force were allowed to share. The officer in charge was a Captain Workman Military Cross. The aircraft were all housed in one big shed with 3 bays, measuring 180 by 120 feet each. So if you multiply the 180 by 3, it will give you, well, not quite 600, but getting on for it. It was treated as the property of Harland and Wolff, with the R.A.F. allowed in under sufferance, interestingly. Indeed, the officer in charge had reported to the Air Ministry in London his understanding that the whole of the buildings on site belonged to Harland and Wolff, further remarking, interestingly, that the manager's office was, and I quote, on a sumptuous scale, panelled in mahogany. Shades of the Titanic, perhaps. The inspectors went on to comment that the facilities for Harland and Wolff's management and men were of an excellent standard. 5 Avros were in their packing cases awaiting erection. 1 Handley Page V1500 was completed, awaiting its first flight and acceptance. Obviously that wasn't the one that had previously been flown out in December 1918. Nevertheless, 5 more were in the course of erection, and 2 Bristol fighters were languishing in a corner, pending the delivery of spare parts. They had been dispatched from England by an officer at the Air Ministry to be delivered, it was believed, to Omagh, and indeed that is quite correct. They were to be delivered, and indeed in due course they were delivered to 105 Squadron, as we heard earlier today. That was somewhat unfortunate, as number 105 Squadron, which had flown RE8s from Omagh from May 1918, had been re-equipped with Bristol fighters in December 1918 and moved to Oranmore in County Galway in January 19. Finally, just a couple of very interesting comments as well. Refuelling equipment at Aldergrove was somewhat limited. And this is interesting, bearing in mind its purpose as the aircraft acceptance park. The 1,000-gallon tanks of the Handley Page V1500s had to be filled by hand from 2-gallon tins. 11,000 gallons were kept in 2-gallon tins in the guardroom. There was in fact a complete bowser system installed, but no pumps. The motor transport section consisted of 3 Clayton tractors, 2 workshop lorries, 1 Ford van, 1 Ford ambulance, 1 Ford touring car, 1 motor roller, 2 Leyland lorries, one of which was unserviceable, 2 Crossley tenders, and 1 Laker trailer. The inspectors considered this provision to be rather excessive, and presumably was more appropriate to the establishment rather than the actual strength. Of the 450 acres of flying field, 215 had been completed. It was noted as being properly drained and in excellent order. Conclusion of report. Hopefully that's been of some interest. I see this time I've managed to finish dead on time. Thanks for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's quite appropriate to finish off an event like this to commemorate the men and the women who served with the Air Force personnel and are either buried or commemorated. I'll be looking at this in 3 sections, being a good Presbyterian. First of all, I'll be looking at First World War, Second World War, and non-war periods, mainly post-Second World War. But it's going to be looking at people who are either buried in Ulster or people who are buried elsewhere but are commemorated on headstones in Ulster. So 2 quite separate things. There's 438 war fatalities from the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force and its associated services who are buried in Ulster. By Ulster, I mean 9 counties, not Northern Ireland. There are at least 141 family memorials and graveyards in Ulster on which airmen who died or were buried overseas are commemorated. Now I say at least because I haven't been to every graveyard in Ulster, but I would be very surprised if there's less than, if I'm missing more than say 20 or 30. So first of all, First World War. The table here shows the numbers for each county, and I'm treating Greater Belfast as being a county, in terms of the numbers of people buried and the numbers of people commemorated. You'll see that obviously for the commemoration side, the numbers are considerably smaller. 36 Commonwealth War Graves fatalities are buried in Ulster, 9 from the Royal Flying Corps and 27 from the Royal Air Force. The first death of an airman buried in Ulster was on 13th November 1916, and the last man was on 27th July 1921. As many of you will know, the Commonwealth War Graves treats the 31st of August 21 as the cut-off date for First World War fatalities. At least 14 airmen are commemorated on family memorials in Ulster, 9 from the Royal Flying Corps, 1 from the Royal Naval Air Service, and 5 from the Royal Air Force. First one I'm going to look at is Walter Ambrose Sterling, who was born on the 8th of March 1904 in the Belfast Maternity Hospital. He was born to Wesley Sterling and Margaret Blair, being the 5th of their 8 children. His father was a hand driller in one of the shipyards in Belfast, and the family was living at Beresford Street, which is off the Shankill Road in West Belfast. They later moved to Loftus Street. Walter was a private second class when he died of pneumonia at the military hospital at R.A.F. Blandford on the 5th of November 1918. His age when he died was 14 years, 243 days. And he's buried in a local graveyard in the Shankill Graveyard in West Belfast. He is the verifiably youngest Irishman to die in the Great War. Just think about that for a minute. 14 years, 243 days old. He didn't serve in France, he didn't serve in a theatre of war, but he's still an official war fatality. And he is the youngest. And he was RAF, which I think makes it quite appropriate. Thomas Malcolmson Greaves was born on the 6th of December 1895 at Princeton Road in Bangor, to Alfred and Anne Francis Greaves, being the second of their 5 children and their eldest son. His father was a flax spinner manager, and in fact the family firm Greaves was one of the large linen manufacturers in Belfast. The family had moved to the Earlswood Road off the Newtonards Road in Belfast by 1901. Thomas was educated at Campbell College, Belfast, which is where I've got this portrait photograph of him from the Men Behind the Glass project. If you get a chance to visit their website, it's very, very informative. They have they have a studio portrait for just about all the ex-pupils or staff from the school who died during the First World War, and PRONI has been involved in digitising these to a very high level, a very high standard, and it is a fantastic project. Sorry, that's just a wee bit of advertising for somebody else. So he was educated at Campbell. He played for the first 15, and he played for the first 11, so he's obviously quite a bit of a sportsman. The family was Plymouth Brethren, and Thomas was working for the family firm Forth River Mills before the war. His first area of service during the war was as a chauffeur for the Friends Ambulance Unit. Friends Ambulance Unit would have been formed by the Society of Friends, the Quakers. They would have been non-military, pacifist to an extent, or to a large extent, so they wouldn't bear arms. But they were prepared to act as ambulance drivers, as first aid, as stretcher bearers. And presumably from his Plymouth Brethren background, he was more attuned initially to serving in a war capacity in a non-combative role. And he was serving in France from June 1915 before he received his commission with the Royal Naval Air Service in May 1917. He was a flight sub-lieutenant with 12 Squadron when he died after his Sopwith Camel F1, and believe me, I know nothing about planes. I was listening to Ernie Cromie there, and I'm just I know nothing about planes, and I'm indebted to Andy Glenfield for keeping me right on what the name of a plane is and what the model is and things like that. That's what he was flying when he crashed 700 yards north of Petit Saint on the 23rd of December 1917 at the age of 22. He's buried in Dunkirk Cemetery, Dunkirk Town Cemetery in France, and is commemorated on this headstone in Belfast City Cemetery. Belfast City Cemetery has a massive number of family memorials, and you can just see Thomas Malcolmson Greaves, Flight Sub-Lieutenant, RNAS, killed in France 23rd December 1917, aged 22 years. So those are the two First World War people that I wanted to talk about. Moving on to the Second World War, and obviously the figures will be greater because, as you will all know, there was in Northern Ireland we did have Air Force bases that were used for various operations, mainly over the Atlantic. 402 Commonwealth War Graves fatalities buried in Ulster, 275 from the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, 103 from the Royal Air Force, 12 from the Royal Air Force Auxiliary Air Force, 10 from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and 2 from the Royal Air Force Ferry Command. I don't know what they did. Does anyone?
Ferried aircraft from one place to another.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure whether they manned the ferry across some stretch of water. It's always good to have experts around it, because RAF, it's not my area of expertise, believe me.
Looking back to the earlier talk, we also had a lot of female pilots.
Yes. Well, we'll come to one of those later, I think. The first Air Force fatality to be buried in Ulster died on 22nd September 1939, so not long after the start of the war. And the last official fatality died on the 17th of November 1947. So you see, we're covering the full extent, the full period of what is classified as the Second World War from a fatality point of view. 10 women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, classified as official war fatalities, are buried in Ulster. They range in age from 20 to 40, and many of those would be involved with the Ferry Command. There are at least 128 Air Force men commemorated in family memorials in graveyards in Ulster for the Second World War. And again, I say at least because I can't be 100% certain I've got them all. On 16th March 1942, a Mark III Vickers Wellington of 57 Squadron Royal Air Force was en route from RAF Beltville to RAF Aldergrove when it crashed into Thomas Mountain in County Down in poor weather. The 3-man crew and 3 passengers were killed, and 1 passenger, a Sergeant Henderson, no relation, was injured.
The pilot, who was Flying Officer Harold Eric Hunter of the New Zealand Air Force. The observer, Flying Officer John William Elliott of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And one of the other passengers, Flight Sergeant Lindsay Ross Williams, Royal Australian Air Force. You can see we're covering all the dominions here, are buried in Belfast City Cemetery, and these are their headstones. The RAF, the Air Force headstones, tend to be down at the bottom end of Glenlena on the banks of the the Ballymurphy River. They're all grouped together, they're all in rows, and they are very well maintained. The other crewman, Sergeant William Swarty Taylor, and one of the other passengers, Sergeant Paul Hendrick Moray of the 108 Squadron, were removed back to England for burial. But the one I really want to hone in on is Section Officer Barbara Kathleen Blakiston Houston, Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She's buried in Loughin Island Church of Ireland graveyard, which is down in County Down. And this is the family memorial. She doesn't have a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, but she is a Commonwealth War Graves fatality. Barbara Kathleen Blakiston Houston was born on 24th November 1917, so not 2 years before or 1 year rather before the armistice in the First World War. And her parents were James Edward and Dorothy Blakiston Houston of Killilay. She was 24 when she died. Her father had been mentioned in dispatches during the First World War while serving with the 8th Hussars. And according to one internet source, and I say according to because I can't verify this, the family were descended from King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, the usurper, as some would have it. Moving on to a local man who is commemorated in Ulster, and this is probably the man I'm going to speak about most. John Archibald Beckett was born in North Street in Lurgan on 14th March 1906 to Samuel Nichol Beckett and Elizabeth Swanton, being the second of their 3 children and their only son. His father was a superintendent for an assurance company, and the family was living at Donnybrook Street in Belfast by 1911. He was educated at St Enoch's Public Elementary School in Belfast and worked as a fitter for the Coombe Barber Textiles Company, who the Barbers were large textile manufacturers mainly in and around Lisburn, but they also manufactured machinery. And he later worked for Harland & Wolff Shipyard. Beckett joined the Royal Air Force in January 1935 and was evacuated from France in 1940, and in 1946 was stationed in the British Mandate territory called Palestine. Although he was a ground crew fitter, on the night of 28th March 1947, he was driving a vehicle which was refuelling a Lancaster of 38 Squadron at the Ain Shemar Air Headquarters. Suddenly a violent fire broke out in the vehicle's pumping compartment, and flames enveloped Sergeant Beckett and set fire to the front of the aircraft, or the fuselage. Another airman beat out the flames on Sergeant Beckett, but not before the latter had sustained very severe burns on the hands and face. There was a grave danger that the main tank of the refueling vehicle would explode, killing or seriously injuring personnel who were working in the vicinity and destroying the 20 or more aircraft in the park. Mindful of this danger and in considerable pain, and you can probably gather from the way it's worded, this is coming straight from the London Gazette citation. Beckett got into the driver's seat of the blazing vehicle and drove at a distance of about 400 yards to a point where it could do no further damage. And this is a man who's just suffered severe burns. At this point, Beckett collapsed and he was taken by ambulance to the station's sick quarters in a dangerously ill condition. The fires in the Lancaster and the vehicle were eventually brought under control and extinguished with no further damage to persons or property. He was awarded the George Cross for his actions. George Cross because it wasn't in the face of the enemy. Sergeant Beckett died of his injuries on 12th April 1947, aged 41 years old, and he's buried in the Kiryat Beach Cemetery in Israel. And he's commemorated on this, wrong button. He's commemorated in this family memorial, which is in Derry Keegan Church of Ireland graveyard in North Antrim. Two of his brothers died during the Second World War and are commemorated on the family memorial. William Beckett on the 20th of April 1940 with the Merchant Navy, and Warrant Officer Samuel Nicol Beckett, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, was killed in action on 11th April 1943 while serving with 429 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, and he's buried in the Rheinberg War Cemetery in Germany. Moving on to non-war deaths and burials. There are at least 24 RAF personnel buried in Ulster who died whilst in service, but not during wartime conditions. And their graves are marked with a particular type of headstone. I'm sure many of you have seen them. They are similar to a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, but there's a slight modification. First one, as it happens, doesn't have one of those headstones. Flying Officer Alfred Archibald McMath was educated at Coleraine Academical Institution and had played rugby for Ulster schools and at interprovincial level. In 1934, he relinquished a position with the Ulster Bank to join the Royal Air Force and had served in Egypt and Iraq before taking up a role as an instructor at Thornaby No. 90 Flying Training School in Yorkshire. He was flying a Fury 2 aircraft from RAF Catford to RAF Aldergrove when he crashed into Divis Mountain. Seems to be a lot of Air Force people crash into mountains. Some reports say that he was on a test flight out of RAF Aldergrove. Others say that he was flying home for the weekend. I don't know which to believe. I'm going by what the news, but the majority of the newspaper reports seem to refer to him flying from Catford, including some from English newspapers, which would add weight to the view that he was on a flight from England over to Northern Ireland. That was on the 12th of June 1937. He was 25 years old when he died, and he's buried in St Mary's Church of Ireland graveyard in McCoskin, County Londonderry. That accident was the 40th for the RAF in 1937 and brought the death toll for that year to 62 personnel. I'm going to save some time, I think. 16th June 1950, moving on to the interwar, the post-war period, the Cold War period, call it what you will. A Handley Page Halifax Met 6 aircraft from RAF Aldergrove had completed a meteorological survey on the west coast of Ireland and was returning to base when the weather conditions deteriorated. In extremely thick fog, the aircraft clipped the top of Crochan Mountain on Achill Island and crashed, killing all 8 crew instantly. Whilst most of the fuselage was removed from the site, 4 large engines remain on the mountainside, and a large boulder painted white marks the location. So you can actually go to Crochan Mountain on Achill Island on a nice sunny day, preferably, which I think this year is the 13th of August. And you'll be able to see the remains of that Handley Page aircraft. These are the RAF style Commonwealth War Graves headstones, if I can use that term. They're very similar in shape, height, width, depth, but they have this lipped curve at the top, and that distinguishes them as being non-war. So they're not war fatalities, they're not Commonwealth War Graves fatalities, but they are military fatalities, and the RAF have this distinctive type of headstone. The Army has another type of headstone which has sharper lips. It tends to come down more at an angle and across rather than curved. You get to know these things when you go around cemeteries. Gunner First Class Martin Gilmartin, 29, and Flying Officer Michael William Horsley, 24, are buried in the Killeigh Church of Ireland graveyard on the what was the RAF Aldergrove base, now Flying Station Aldergrove, I believe. And there's quite a few others in Killeigh that are similar to that, mixed in with Commonwealth War Graves headstones. 19th of April 1968. Squadron leader Clive Haggett and a crew from 204 Squadron departed from RAF Ballykelly in a Mark II Avro Shackleton to take part in a live anti-submarine exercise with HM submarine Onyx to the south of the Mull of Kintyre. In poor weather conditions, under a cloud base of 400 feet, the Shackleton turned over the narrow coastal strip to practice an attack on the submarine and then repeated the exercise. However, on the second pass, it flew further inland and crashed into Glenmulet Hill on the Mull of Kintyre with the loss of 11 lives. 6 of the crew are buried in Tamliffe and Lagan Church of Ireland graveyard in Ballykelly, which was adjacent to the RAF base. Flight Lieutenant Roger John Duncan Denny, age 31, was the navigator. Flight Lieutenant Rodney Helens, 27, was the air electronics officer. Flight Lieutenant George Cravey Fiskin, 26, was the navigator. And Flying Officer Michael Creedon, 24, was a pilot. Flight Sergeant Thomas Frederick Anglin Buttermore, age 33, was another air electronics operator. And Sergeant Bruce Robert Dixon, 24, was also an air electronics operator. This memorial here is on the Mull of Kintyre, and again it names the 11 men. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings this whistle-stop tour, and I think I saved 5 minutes there. So I was told I had 30 minutes, but aim for 20, so I came in just between the two. I could have talked for hours on Air Force personnel buried or commemorated in Ulster. I had to be very, very selective, and it was difficult sometimes picking up. I've got this one and I've got this one, so I tended to go with trying to cover the bases. You have to see what I did there? Covered the bases, yeah. Okay.